Hello everyone. This month has been really hard for the channel, and I truly need your support more than ever. It feels like my videos aren't reaching you anymore, and notifications aren't working as before. Please like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications. If we reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments, it will really help me continue. My name is Kaio, and I accepted the position at Glacier National Park because I had nothing left to lose. That sounds dramatic when I write it, but it's the honest truth. The divorce had gutted my savings. The construction company I'd worked for went under in the economic collapse of late 2022. My apartment lease was being bought out by developers, and my landlord was pushing everyone out. My daughter had gone to live with her mother in Portland, and the custody arrangement meant I could barely afford the drive up to see her twice a month. The Park Service job posting appeared at 3 a.m. while I was scrolling through employment listings on my phone, sitting in the dark of what used to be my apartment. The position was for a seasonal ranger at Glacier, based out of the remote Gunsite Lake patrol station. It was temporary, May through October, and the pay was modest, but housing was provided, and the location meant I'd be almost entirely alone in a section of the park most visitors never reached. After everything, the isolation appealed to me. I wanted to disappear into something that mattered. National parks had always meant something to me, a place where the world made sense through observation and care. The interview was brief. The park supervisor, a woman named Reeves who looked like she'd spent 20 years in the high country, asked me 3 questions. Could I handle emergencies in remote terrain? Did I have SR training? Was I willing to spend months alone? I answered yes to all 3. She hired me on the spot. Now, sitting in the small cabin beside Gunsite Lake in early May, I understood what I'd actually agreed to. The cabin was solid but minimal. A wood stove, a bed with a thin mattress, a radio that crackled with weather reports and occasional ranger chatter, and a propane stove that took patience to light. A window faced north toward the lake. The surrounding mountains held the last heavy snow at their peaks, and the forest around me consisted of dense stands of lodgepole pine and subalpine fir. The nearest ranger station was 18 miles away. The nearest town was 40. I was genuinely alone. The first month passed without incident. I did what rangers do. I hiked the patrol routes, checking for signs of poaching, downed trees, trail damage, and safety issues. I maintained the cabin, processed the reports, and documented wildlife activity. I spotted elk, mountain goats, and black bears from a distance. I worked until I was so physically exhausted that sleep came immediately. This was what I wanted. Solitude has a way of letting your mind wander, though. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of instant coffee, watching the lake shift colors as the light changed. I thought about my daughter, about the life that had collapsed, about the man I used to be before everything fell apart. But mostly, I thought about nothing at all. I let my mind settle into the rhythms of the place, the sound of wind through the trees, the distant calls of birds I couldn't identify. Then June arrived, and something changed. It started with the calls. I first heard it on June 3rd, a Saturday. I was cataloging supplies in the cabin, updating the inventory sheet, when I heard a voice from outside. It sounded like someone calling my name, Kaio. A clear, human voice, definitely a man's voice, calling from somewhere near the tree line about 60 yards from the cabin. I went to the window and scanned the forest. Nothing. The trees were still, the clearing empty. I waited several minutes, but I heard nothing else. I figured it was a hiker who'd gotten disoriented. It happened sometimes, despite the warning signs and maintained trails. I grabbed the radio and tried to check in with the nearest station, but the signal was weak and I only got static. I took the emergency pack, a first aid kit, and a bear horn, then headed toward where I'd heard the voice. The forest was dense. Pine needles carpeted the ground, and the undergrowth was thick with low shrubs and fallen branches. It was the kind of terrain where someone could get turned around quickly, especially if they'd strayed from the marked trails. I called out several times as I walked, identifying myself as a ranger, but got no response. After about 20 minutes of searching, I gave up. The voice had come from somewhere in that direction, but in a forest, sound travels strangely. It could have come from much farther away. I decided the person had probably kept moving, found their way back to a trail, and continued on. This wasn't unusual, but then it happened again the next evening. This time, I was in the cabin, reading a novel I'd brought with me. The voice came from closer to the window. It sounded like someone was standing just outside, calling my name with a particular urgency. Kaio. Hey Kaio, over here. I went outside immediately, the bear horn in my hand. The clearing was empty. The lake reflected the dimming sky. The forest stood silent. This unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Over the next week, the calls continued. They came at odd hours. Sometimes they sounded like they were coming from the north, sometimes from the east. Sometimes the voice seemed to be calling from the lake itself. And the voice was always urgent, always sounding like someone who needed help. The thing that troubled me most was how familiar it sounded, in a way I couldn't quite place. It wasn't an accent I recognized, and I couldn't determine the exact age of whoever was calling. It was just a voice, a man's voice calling my name into the wilderness. On June 12th, I hiked into the ranger station at Lake McDonald and spoke to Marcus, the chief ranger for that section of the park. He was in his 50s, weathered from decades working in the mountains. I felt foolish describing what I'd heard, but I did anyway. Voices, he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Calling my name. Sounds real, but I can't find anyone. Marcus made coffee slowly, taking his time. He didn't seem surprised. The cabin's been staffed intermittently for about 15 years, he said finally. Usually seasonals like you. We've had 3 rangers request transfers out of that station. They all cited similar reasons. Sounds, voices. One of them said it was his brother's voice calling him into the forest. His brother lives in Minnesota. They hadn't spoken in 10 years. I felt my stomach tighten. What happened to them? They left, went back to their regular jobs, or moved to different park districts. One transferred to a park in Arizona and never had the problem again. Marcus poured the coffee carefully. One of them, a woman named Ruth. She didn't leave in time. What does that mean? She went into the forest to look for the voices, tried to find the source. She was missing for 2 days before the search team found her. She was in a ravine about a quarter mile from the cabin, lying in about 8 feet of water in a small pond. Her ankle was broken, and she had lacerations on her legs like she'd been thrashing through brush. She claimed she never saw anyone. The voices had just kept leading her deeper and deeper into the woods, and she kept following because they sounded like they needed her. I didn't know what to say. The official report says she slipped and fell, Marcus continued. But the medical examiner found something odd. There were marks on her shoulders and upper back, consistent with being gripped but not violently, like something had held her but wasn't trying to hurt her. At least not in any obvious way. That's just trauma from the fall, I said. Probably, Marcus agreed, and he didn't sound convinced. He told me to spend the next few weeks documenting when and where I heard the voices, what they said, any patterns. He said he'd inform the superintendent. He also said that if the phenomenon intensified, I should request a transfer without hesitation. There's nothing wrong with leaving that cabin, he said. Some places don't agree with some people, that's all. I returned to my station with that conversation weighing on me. I set up a notebook and started recording the voice incidents with dates, times, and directions. By the end of June, I had 23 entries. The calls had become more frequent, and they'd begun changing. The voice no longer just called my name. Now it was saying things like, I need help, and can you hear me? And once, most disturbing, why won't you come? I didn't go looking for the voices anymore. I stayed near the cabin, kept the doors locked, and tried to convince myself that what Marcus had told me was just old stories, the kind of folklore that accumulates around isolated places. But the calls continued, and with each one, my rational explanations grew thinner. By July, I had stopped leaving the cabin during the hours when the voice typically called. This was late afternoon and early evening, between 4 p.m. and full darkness. I would finish my patrol work in the mornings, then spend the afternoons inside, maintaining equipment and doing the administrative work that the ranger position required. But this meant I was spending more time in the cabin than I liked. And I was listening, waiting, hoping each day that the voice wouldn't come, and dreading it when it did. The calls had shifted again. Now the voice was speaking in longer sentences, and they were always framed as requests or questions. Why don't you ever answer me? Are you there, Ko? I've been waiting so long. Don't you remember? Just come to the water. It's not far. I sound like someone you know. Do you recognize me? The last one had shaken me deeply. Because the thing was, I was beginning to recognize the voice. Not because it was anyone I actually knew, but because it was familiar in the way that dreams are familiar. It had the contours of someone from my past. Someone important, but I couldn't place who. My father, maybe, though he died when I was 12. Or someone from my childhood. The closer I listened, the more I felt I should know who it was. I called Marcus again on July 5th. It's getting worse, I told him. How much worse? It's changing what it says. It's no longer just calling out. It's having a conversation with me. Or trying to. There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. Do you feel unsafe? Marcus asked. I feel watched. I feel like something is trying to get me to leave the cabin, to go into the forest. Then don't go into the forest. But what if someone actually needs help? Kaio, listen to me carefully, whatever this is, and I'm not saying it's anything more than acoustic phenomena or wildlife. Your job is to stay safe and stay in place. If an actual hiker needed help, they'd have a satellite phone or they'd reach the main trails eventually. You don't go into that forest looking for this voice. I said I understood, and I did. But I was also beginning to feel the pull of that voice in a way that was hard to explain. It wasn't like a supernatural compulsion or anything theatrical like that. It was more subtle. It was the way that I found myself standing at the window, looking out toward the forest, waiting to hear that familiar note. It was the way I had begun listening so intently that other sounds seemed to fade away. It was the way that part of me, a deep and old part, wanted to know who was calling my name. The second week of July brought cold rain, the kind that lasted for days, turning the cabin damp and the forest into a gray blur of trees and mist. I sat by the wood stove, trying to read but finding I couldn't concentrate on the page. The voice came less frequently during the rain, which was a relief and somehow also a disappointment. On the fifth day of rain, a Saturday evening, I was making dinner when I heard something different from outside. Not the voice, but actual sounds. Footsteps, someone moving through the brush near the cabin, crunching on wet branches and needles. My first instinct was to be relieved. It sounded like an actual person, but there was something wrong with how the person was moving. The footsteps were wrong. They were too irregular, stopping and starting, moving in directions that didn't make sense. And the breathing I could hear between steps was loud and almost rhythmic, like someone forcing themselves to breathe in a particular pattern. I looked out the window but saw nothing in the rain and fog. Hello? I called. This is a ranger station. I'm coming outside. The sounds stopped immediately. The forest became silent except for the sound of falling rain. I waited 10 minutes, then 20. Nothing returned. When I finally opened the door and swept my flashlight beam across the clearing, the ground was mud and standing water. There were no footprints, nothing to suggest that anyone had been out there, but I had heard something. I was sure of that. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed listening to every sound the cabin made, every shift of wind, every patter of rain. And sometime in the hours after midnight, I heard the voice again, softer than before, almost like a whisper coming through the walls of the cabin itself. It sounded like it was right beside me, right there in the darkness. I'm getting closer, it said. I turned on every light in the cabin and sat in the kitchen until dawn, waiting for the forest to reveal itself in the morning light. July 17th brought a hiker emergency that broke my routine. A group of hikers had reported a missing person on the Jackson Glacier Pass Trail. The young woman, aged 24, had separated from her group and hadn't returned. By the time the report came in on the radio, she'd been missing for 4 hours. This was my actual job. This was what I was trained for. Marcus coordinated the SAR response from Lake McDonald. I was tasked with checking the emergency shelter stations on the pass and the route leading back toward the lower trails. If she'd gotten disoriented and sought shelter, that's where I'd find her. It meant leaving the cabin, heading into the forest, and spending most of the day alone in the wilderness. I was terrified and grateful in equal measure. The weather had cleared completely. The mountains were brilliant against blue sky, the temperature climbing toward the 70s. I packed the SIR kit, informed the radio operators that I was heading out, and set off toward the pass. For the first few hours, the calls didn't come. Or if they did, I was too focused on the task to hear them. I moved quickly but carefully, checking the marked trail, calling out the missing hiker's name at regular intervals. The forest around me felt different when I was moving through it with purpose. The trees didn't seem to close in so much. The shadows seemed less watching. By early afternoon, I'd found nothing at the shelter stations or along the upper pass. I was heading back down when I decided to take a shortcut I knew. It would save 40 minutes on the return, and I wanted to get back before dark. The route cut through an older section of forest where lodgepole pines had died and fallen in the 1988 fires. The ground was more open there, the trees more sparse. That's where I heard the voice again, but this time, it wasn't calling from a distance. It was close. So close, it sounded like it came from behind me. When I spun around, I saw something at the edge of my vision. A shape, tall, thin, moving between the dead trees with a gait that was almost wrong, like the person's joints bent in directions that were too flexible. I called out again, identifying myself as a ranger. The shape stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard the voice, coming from approximately where the shape was, but distorted in a way I couldn't define. It sounded like my voice, exactly like my voice. "Help me," it said, in words that came from my own mouth. My own accent, my own cadence, my own specific way of forming the word help. I didn't move. I couldn't process what I was hearing. "Please," the thing said, still in my voice. "I'm so lost. Help me find my way." I understood, in that moment, that I was not looking for a missing hiker. I understood that the woman who'd gone missing on the pass was probably fine, had probably made her way back to her group or to a trail, and that my radio would confirm that very soon. And I understood that the voice I'd been hearing all month, the voice calling my name and asking me to come into the forest, was not a person. It was not a ghost or a hallucination or an acoustic anomaly. It was something that could stand in front of me wearing my own face and sound, my own voice, my own words. It was something that had been hunting me for weeks. Something that had learned how I spoke, learned what would make me listen, learned exactly which version of my own voice would make me want to follow it into the trees. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the SAR protocol or the missing hiker or the path I was supposed to take. I ran downslope, crashing through the forest, the dead trees tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me I could hear the thing following, not running, but moving quickly, purposefully, in the way something moves when it knows the terrain and knows that speed isn't necessary. And it was calling after me. In my own voice. In every voice it had used over the past month. In voices I didn't recognize but felt I should. In voices that spoke my name, my childhood nickname, my daughter's name. It was calling with dozens of voices, layering them over each other, and each one was exactly right. Each one was someone I knew, or someone I should know, or someone I was afraid of knowing. My radio buzzed. Marcus's voice came through, asking for a status update. "Get SAR to my location," I gasped. "Now. There's something in the forest. There's something wrong. Copy that. Stay in one place. Help is en route." I made it back to the cabin somehow. I ran the last 2 miles on pure adrenaline, and I locked myself inside, checking every door and window, pulling the curtains closed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the radio, but no one came. No SAR team, no Marcus, no help, because while I'd been in the forest, my radio had been receiving reports. The missing hiker had been found. She was at the Jackson Glacier trailhead, confused but unharmed. She claimed she'd never been lost at all. She said she'd been hiking the whole time, and she'd seen exactly one other person on the trail. A tall man in a ranger uniform who'd guided her back to the main path, spoken in a pleasant voice, and then disappeared into the forest when she'd thanked him. The description matched me. Height, build, uniform, everything. The authorities arrived 3 days later, and by then I'd already fallen apart. I'd told them everything over the radio, and my account had been documented and reported. The park superintendent had ordered me to remain in the cabin and await official investigation. Psychological evaluation was mentioned. Stress-induced episodes were discussed. The implication was clear. I was losing my mind, but I knew what I'd experienced. 2 rangers came to escort me out of the station, along with a psychiatrist and a medical technician. They arrived by helicopter, which landed in the clearing I'd been staring at for months. The rangers were professional and kind, treating me like someone who was fragile. The psychiatrist spoke to me like I was a child, asking me questions in a voice designed to be calming. The technician took my pulse and temperature and asked me when I'd last eaten. I told them everything again, and I watched their faces register the same skepticism, the same careful concern, the same barely concealed assumption that I'd spent too long in isolation and my mind had broken under the weight of it. As we were preparing to leave, as my belongings were being loaded into the helicopter, I heard the voice one final time, but not with my ears. It came through the radio in my hand, clear and distinct on the emergency frequency. It said goodbye, in my own voice, with my own inflection and my own particular way of drawing out the O sound. One of the rangers looked at me, and I could see him making a note. Another thing to document as evidence of my deterioration. Another sign that I should never have been alone in that place. I spent 6 weeks in evaluation. The psychiatric team was thorough and professional. They tested my cognition, my memory, my emotional responses. They examined my history for indicators of psychosis or dissociative episodes. They found nothing conclusive. I was depressed, yes. Stressed, absolutely. Isolated, clearly. But not delusional, not lying, not experiencing a classic break with reality. They couldn't explain what had happened. Neither could I, in a way that made sense to them. In the end, I was released with a strong recommendation not to return to remote seasonal positions. I was advised to seek ongoing mental health support, to remain in community settings, and to avoid isolation. There was a suggestion that the Park Service might want to revisit the staffing of the Gunsite Lake cabin, but nothing official was ever announced. I moved back to Missoula, rented an apartment, and got a job at a visitor center. My daughter came to stay with me for 2 weeks in August, and I tried very hard to seem normal. I took her on hikes through national forests where there were always other people around, in cleared areas, with cell service and rescue stations nearby, but I kept researching. I looked into historical records of the area around Glacier. I found old Native American accounts of forest spirits that could mimic voices and draw people into the wilderness. I found descriptions that matched what I'd seen, stories from tribes in the region that had specific names for the phenomenon, warnings about certain places and certain times of year when the forest became dangerous. Most of what I found was vague and anthropological, documented by outsiders who dismissed the accounts as superstition, but there were consistencies. The voice mimic that learned and adapted, the way it could sound exactly like someone you knew, the way it fed on the isolation and the desire to help. In November, I received a phone call from Marcus. He never explained how he got my number. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "It's not official. It won't be in any report. But I wanted you to know." "Okay," I said. "That woman who was reported missing on the Jackson Glacier Pass Trail. Her group found her, you know. She got separated and found her own way back. But she made a report herself, requested it be kept quiet, asked the Park Service not to pursue a formal investigation." "What kind of report?" "She said that she'd heard someone calling to her in the forest. A man who said he was a ranger. She said she followed the voice for about 20 minutes before she realized it was leading her in circles, leading her deeper. The thing that scared her most was that the voice kept changing. It started sounding like her father, then her ex-boyfriend, then her brother who died when she was 17. It was speaking things it had no way of knowing, private things, personal things." I didn't say anything. "I'm telling you this because I want you to know you're not crazy. I want you to know that 3 rangers before you and now the missing hiker all experienced something at that station, something real, and I want you to know that it's not something that happens to people who don't belong there. It happens to people with empathy, people who want to help, people who would follow a voice into the dark because they genuinely thought someone needed them." "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know. I've worked here for 23 years and I don't know. But I've worked with the local tribes and they have stories, old stories. They don't go to that lake much anymore. They say the thing that lives there gets hungry, especially in summer when there are more people in the park. And it gets better at calling each year. They say it learns." "Why didn't you tell me this when I applied for the job? Would it have changed your mind?" I thought about that. I thought about my life before the cabin, the emptiness and the desperation. I thought about how that isolation had felt like a solution, like a place to disappear into where nothing could hurt me because there was nothing to hurt. "No," I said finally. "It wouldn't have." "That's why I didn't tell you," Marcus said. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment with the lights on. Outside, Missoula was bustling with the evening activity of a normal town. Cars passed, people walked. The ordinary world continued around me, but I was thinking about the Gunsite Lake cabin. I was thinking about it sitting empty now, with no ranger to maintain it, no one walking the patrol routes. I was thinking about autumn coming, about the visitor season ending, about fewer and fewer people in the park. I was thinking about deep winter, when the mountains became even more isolated. I was thinking about whether the voice was still there, still calling into the empty forest, still learning and improving and waiting for the next person who was desperate enough to take the job. And I was thinking about my daughter, and how she'd sounded happy on the phone yesterday. How I needed to focus on that, on being present, on being normal, on never being alone in a place where something could learn exactly how to call to me, exactly what words would make me listen, exactly how to wear my own voice like a mask. 3 months after leaving the park, I received an email from a researcher. Her name was Dr. Claire Vanders, and she was a bioacoustic specialist at the University of Montana. She'd been contacted by Marcus about my case, and she'd also been in communication with the Park Service and 2 of the other rangers who'd experienced similar phenomena. She asked if I would be willing to participate in a study about what she called advanced vocal mimicry in wildlife. She was theorizing that what we'd experienced might be a previously undocumented species or subspecies that had an extraordinary capability for vocal imitation, not something supernatural, not something that required anything other than biology to explain. I agreed to meet with her, though I wasn't sure I believed her hypothesis even as I encouraged her to pursue it. We met in her lab, a cluttered space on the university campus filled with audio equipment and computers covered in graphs and waveform analysis software. She was in her late 40s, with an intensity about her that suggested she'd spent most of her life listening to things other people couldn't hear. She played me recordings. The first set were from my time at the cabin. I'd had an audio logger running the whole time, documenting wildlife sounds and weather. The recordings contained the voice. As I listened to them played back through professional-grade speakers, they sounded different, stranger. The voice had a quality to it that I hadn't consciously noticed when I was hearing it in real time. There was a faint underlying tone, a resonance that didn't quite match the normal range of human speech. It was there in every recording, a consistent element that marked it as not quite right. "What am I hearing?" I asked. "That's the interesting part," Dr. Vanders said. "The underlying harmonics don't match human vocal production. The frequencies are all correct for the words being spoken, but there's this additional component, like someone is overlaying multiple sound sources to create the effect of a single voice." She pulled up a spectrogram on her computer showing the visual representation of the sound's frequencies. It looked like a complex map, with certain areas highlighted in red. "These red zones," she said, "are where your normal human speech would be. But see these other peaks? These frequencies shouldn't be there. They suggest the sound is being produced by something with a different vocal structure." "Different how?" I asked. "That's what I'm still working out. But I have a theory." She showed me recordings from the other rangers. Each one contained variations, but all had those same strange harmonics underneath the clearly human-like speech. She played me recordings of wildlife from the park, especially the calls of animals in the upper elevation areas where the cabin was located. Elk, wolves, mountain goats, coyotes, bears, and then she played me something else. Something that had been recorded by a trail camera high in the mountains, near the cabin's patrol area. The footage was from early evening, near the tree line, and it showed something moving through the brush. The camera had captured only a few seconds of video before the animal moved out of frame, but the audio had picked up something. The thing on the video was bipedal, or at least it moved in a way that suggested a preference for two legs. Its shape was roughly human but elongated. Its head seemed too large, and from its throat came a sound that was precisely like a human voice calling a human name. But the sound came with that same underlying harmonic signature I'd heard in the recordings from the cabin. "What is that?" I asked. "That," Dr. Vanders said, "is what I'm trying to determine." The trail camera was installed as part of a grizzly bear study. It wasn't supposed to be recording anything else. The footage caused quite a stir, and it's been hidden away in the Park Service files because no one could figure out what to do with it. But I was given access as part of my research. "It's a person," I said. "It has to be. Then why has no one ever documented it? Why are there no photographs, no body measurements, no skeletal remains? Why does it appear only in remote areas, almost exclusively near the cabin, and only in the presence of specific types of people?" "What types?" "People who are alone, people who are isolated, people who want to help others, people who are capable of empathy and responsibility. The ones who hear the voice aren't random, they're targeted. The thing learns about them, mimics people they know, draws them in with what sounds like an emergency. That's still supernatural," I said. "No," Dr. Vanders replied. "Predatory mimicry is a well-documented strategy in the animal kingdom. Anglerfish use bioluminescence to mimic the prey of larger fish. Killdeer birds mimic wounded prey to draw predators away from their nests. Fireflies use light patterns to mimic the mating signals of other species. The natural world is full of creatures that have evolved to mimic other animals' communication methods to achieve predatory aims. But this would require understanding human psychology. It would require learning and adapting in ways that suggest intelligence. Cetaceans do it. Dolphins mimic human speech. Some corvids mimic human speech. Parrots don't just repeat words, they learn when to use them contextually. Intelligence and vocal mimicry aren't exclusive to humans. This creature, whatever it is, may simply have evolved an exceptional predatory strategy based on vocal imitation." I sat with that idea for a moment. It was almost more disturbing than the supernatural explanation. A creature that hunted humans through understanding, through learning, through adaptation. Something that got better at hunting with each attempt. "Why me?" I asked. "Why was I targeted?" "I have some hypotheses," Dr. Vanders said. "The rangers who experienced this all had something in common. They were all grieving. They were all in situations where they'd experienced loss or were isolated from the people they cared about. The first ranger, Ruth, had just gone through a divorce. The second ranger, a man named Gregory, had lost his father a year before. You were recently divorced and separated from your daughter. The missing hiker was mourning her brother. The thing seems to hunt people who are emotionally vulnerable, whose isolation makes them susceptible to the specific voices it uses. That's incredibly specific. That's incredibly effective, Dr. Vanders corrected. If I were a predator that hunted through vocal mimicry, and I'd learned that certain emotional states make people more likely to follow my voice into dangerous terrain, I would specialize in prey that exhibits those emotional states. The creature has the capacity for learning. It's using that capacity to become a more successful predator. So what does it do to them, I asked. To the people it catches. Dr. Vanders looked away. I don't know, Ruth was lucky. She fell before the thing could do whatever it intended to do. But the ones who disappeared, how many disappeared? 3 that we can document. 2 hikers in the 1990s. 1 ranger in 2001. All missing near the cabin. All connected to the reports of voices. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, but I heard very little of it. My mind was fixed on the idea that there were people out there, people in the wilderness, possibly alive somewhere, living with what had been done to them by a creature that could think and learn and improve at predation. As I was leaving, Dr. Vanders called me back. One more thing, she said. Marcus mentioned that you left the park suddenly, that you were evacuated for psychological evaluation. Yes, I've reviewed the reports. The psychiatrists couldn't find any evidence of psychosis. No delusions, no hallucinations, no inability to distinguish reality. You experienced something terrifying, but you experienced it clearly. You saw it. You heard it. Your mind processed it correctly. The experience was real. So why did they think I was crazy? Because a creature like this shouldn't exist. Because the evidence suggests something that contradicts our understanding of biology. Because your rational mind was insisting on something that the scientific establishment says is impossible. The doctors weren't wrong about you. The system was just unprepared for the possibility that you'd encountered something it couldn't categorize. I thanked her and left her lab. As I drove back to my apartment, I kept thinking about those 3 missing people. I kept thinking about a creature that had learned to sound exactly like the voices of people they loved. A predator that understood grief and isolation well enough to weaponize them, and I kept thinking about whether the creature was still learning, whether it was still improving, whether each failure to catch a human made it better at the strategy, better at understanding what would work next time. 7 months after leaving the cabin, I received a call from the Park Service. They were offering me my job back, the same position, the same cabin, same salary, but with additional compensation for the trauma I'd experienced and with what they described as enhanced support. I asked why they would want me back. Because, the supervisor said, a new woman named Patricia. We've had more incidents. 2 more rangers have reported the voice phenomenon. One of them is missing. The reality was simple. The Park Service knew there was something in that cabin's territory, and they needed someone who'd experienced it and survived. Someone who understood what to look for. Someone who wouldn't dismiss reports from other rangers or think they were losing their minds. They were asking me to return to the thing that had haunted me. They were asking me to go back to the place where something was learning how to hunt more effectively with each passing season. I told them I needed a day to think about it. That night I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment, thinking about the missing ranger. I thought about what might have happened to her. I thought about her family, about whether they were searching, about whether she was still alive somewhere, changed by whatever the thing had done. I thought about my daughter. I thought about the life I was building, the normalcy I was returning to, the distance I was putting between myself and the wilderness. And I thought about Ruth, who had fallen in that ravine, whose broken ankle and lacerations were the only reason she was still alive. I thought about the creature, standing over her in the water, touching her with that grip Marcus had described, learning something from her that made it better at hunting. At 3 in the morning, I accepted the position. I didn't call the Park Service. I just made my decision and held it. By dawn, I had packed. By afternoon, I'd made arrangements. By the following week, I was driving north again, toward Glacier. The cabin was the same, but also different. Autumn had turned the forest gold and red. The lake reflected the changing colors. The mountains held their first permanent snow of the season. It was beautiful in a way that broke my heart, because I knew now what lived in this beauty. I knew what hunted in this wilderness. I set up again, slowly, methodically. I checked all my equipment. I tested the radio. I confirmed supply chains and communication protocols. I logged all my movements with the rangers at the other stations. I was hyper-vigilant about safety in a way the first ranger I'd been as couldn't have imagined. I also set up recording equipment, better equipment than what had been there before. At Dr. Vander's suggestion, I installed a networked system that would record audio 24 hours a day, uploading the files to secure servers. We wanted to capture the creature again, wanted more samples, wanted to build a case that would force the scientific community to take the phenomenon seriously. And I set up cameras, motion-activated trail cameras, at strategic points around the cabin, audio recorders near the tree line, heat sensors that would detect any large body moving near the cabin at night. The voice came for me on the first evening, just as the sun was setting. It called my name from the forest, and this time I had spent months preparing for it. I had spent months understanding that the sound was real, that the creature was real, that I was not insane or broken or imagining things. I stood on the porch and listened. The voice was trying something new. It was calling to me in a voice that sounded like someone from much deeper in my past, a coach I'd had in high school, a man who'd believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. The creature had learned about my vulnerabilities, my needs, the specific people whose voices would make me open my mind and heart. But this time, I didn't follow. Instead, I began to document it. I made notes. I checked the recordings. I sent the data to Dr. Vanders. I worked with Marcus to coordinate a new study. And each night, as the creature called from the forest, as it refined its approach and tested new voices and new methods, I listened without answering. The missing ranger, a woman named Alita, was found 3 weeks after I returned to the cabin. She was alive, barely. She'd been in a hidden location in the mountains, in a small cave near Alpine Lake, for 6 weeks. When the search and rescue team brought her out, she was dehydrated, malnourished, and completely silent. She didn't speak for 2 weeks after being brought to the hospital. When she finally did, she said very little. She said she'd followed the voice. She said it had led her places she didn't remember. She said she'd heard things, seen things, been shown things that didn't make sense. She said the worst part wasn't the physical trauma. The worst part was that while she was missing, while she was in that cave, the creature had continued calling to her. And by the time she heard the rescue helicopters, she was no longer sure if she wanted to be rescued. She was no longer sure if the voice calling to her was a predator or something else entirely. The Park Service is conducting a full investigation now. There are official reports being filed. Dr. Vanders is developing her research further, expanding into a larger study that's beginning to get attention from universities and wildlife research centers. The scientific community is starting to have conversations it never wanted to have, but the voice still calls from the forest around the Gunsite Lake cabin. It still learns, it still adapts, and I still sit in this cabin, listening, recording, documenting, understanding that I'm not solving the problem, I'm not saving anyone, I'm simply bearing witness to something that the world isn't ready to understand. A creature that hunts through the deepest parts of human longing and grief. A predator that knows exactly what voices we need to hear, and that's willing to spend years learning how to use them against us. The isolation I came here to find has become something I can't escape, but at least now I understand what the isolation was protecting me from, and what it's putting me in front of. My daughter calls sometimes and I tell her I'm fine, I'm doing important work, I'm helping people. But inside, I'm always listening, I'm always waiting, I'm always wondering if the next voice the thing learns to mimic will be hers, and whether I'll be strong enough to not answer when it comes. The mountains are beautiful. The forest is calm. And beneath both, something continues to hunt. I took the ranger position at Tamarack Station because I needed to disappear, not in the criminal sense, nothing like that. I was a wildlife biologist who had spent 7 years in the lower 48, working in university laboratories and government surveys, always surrounded by people, always observed. After the divorce and the incident at the university that I still don't discuss in detail, I requested a transfer to the most remote station in Glacier National Park that would have me. The position paid less than my previous work, but the isolation was the currency that mattered. My supervisor at the regional office, a woman named Marcia Chen, who actually seemed to understand what I was asking for without my having to fully explain it, assigned me to Tamarack. The station sits roughly 18 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by hiking trail or the old Ranger Service road that becomes impassable between October and April. October was when I arrived, the larches turning that particular gold that gives the place its name. The cabin itself was built in 1954 and has been maintained competently but not luxuriously ever since. Stone foundation, timber frame, 2 rooms plus a kitchen area and a small bathroom connected to a cistern system that collects rainwater. The solar panels on the roof seemed incongruous with everything else about the place, but they worked, providing just enough power for the radio equipment and the critical freezer where I'd store samples. Through the east window you could see Tamarack Lake, a body of water about 2 miles long and half that wide, pristine and cold even in summer. The job was straightforward: monitor wildlife populations, conduct surveys, maintain the trails, respond to emergency calls, document changes in the ecosystem. In winter, mostly it meant being present, being a visible authority, discouraging poaching and ensuring that any hikers foolish enough to venture into the mountains during the bad months could be reached if something went wrong. It was the kind of work that could fill your entire attention or could be done in such a way that it left your mind free to wander. I had assumed I would choose the latter approach, to let the routine physical work settle some of the anxiety that had followed me since leaving the university. The first few weeks were exactly what I needed. I hiked the major trails, documented the condition of bridges and switchbacks, checked the water systems, and began setting up the camera traps I would use to monitor predator populations. The autumn was mild and extended that year, and I found genuine peace in the physical work, in the silence that was never truly silent. It was full of wind in the trees, water moving in the streams, the calls of birds beginning their migrations. I had been alone in the cabin for 32 days when I found the first one. I was out checking a camera trap near the north ridge of the valley, about 4 miles from the station, in an area where the forest transitions from dense spruce and fir to more open larch stands. The trap itself had malfunctioned. The infrared sensor had been damaged somehow, torn at an angle that suggested something had deliberately broken it. This wasn't unusual in bear country. What was unusual was what I found 100 yards away, deeper in among the thicker trees. It was a deer, a mule deer doe, and it was positioned in a way that made my stomach tighten immediately. The animal was not simply dead, it was arranged. The body was positioned with its legs extended outward, back arched in a posture that no predation pattern would create. The organs were exposed with surgical precision, the chest cavity laid open as if by intention rather than violence. The head was intact, the eyes still open, and the mouth held something. I approached slowly, my hand resting on the bear spray on my belt, though I couldn't articulate why I felt I needed it. The thing in the deer's mouth was a bird, a Clark's nutcracker, positioned between the dead teeth with its wings spread. Both animals were partially decomposed, but not enough to hide the deliberation of their arrangement. The smell underneath the October air was wrong. I had found enough carrion in my years of fieldwork to know what animals smelled like in death. This smelled like that, but with something else underneath. Something chemical and ancient and like nothing I could quite place. I photographed the scene with the camera I carried, documented the GPS coordinates, and tried to explain to myself what I was seeing. A predator kill made no sense with this arrangement. Possibly a human, a hiker with disturbing impulses. Possibly something more complex involving scavengers and natural settling, though the positioning argued strongly against that explanation. I marked the location and moved on, though my concentration for the rest of the day's work was broken. Back at the station that evening, I filed a report with the Central Ranger office, including the photos. Marce's response came through on the radio the following morning, calm and professional. The photographs were strange, but not unprecedented. Wildlife behavior sometimes appeared designed to our eyes even when it arose from pure animal instinct. I should document any similar findings and continue my standard patrols. If I encountered any evidence of human activity beyond the normal trails, that would be worth noting more urgently. I accepted this assessment. I had no better explanation, and part of me wanted to accept the rational world in which such things could be explained away. I was good at accepting explanations that helped me sleep. I had been practicing that skill since childhood. The lake had begun to freeze at the edges by late October, thin sheets of ice forming at night and breaking under the sun by afternoon. I maintained my regular schedules and tried not to think about the deer and the bird, though the image had settled into my mind in a way that I recognized from my time with the university. Certain observations once made have a weight that no rationalization can fully dispel. On the 39th day, I found 2 more. This time they were closer to the station, less than a mile away, in a small clearing near one of the major water sources that the elk herds relied on. Another deer, this one a young buck, and a beaver that must have wandered from the lake. They were positioned in the same manner, organs exposed with precision, the smaller animal placed inside the larger. The smell was worse this time, more complex, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid it. The decomposition suggested these had been placed here within the past 12 hours. I radioed Marcia again. This time there was a longer pause before her response came through. She asked specific questions. Had I observed any human activity in the area? Any signs of recent camp or trail use? Had any other rangers reported unusual incidents in adjacent territories? The answers were all no. The only tracks in the soft ground around the arrangement were too disrupted to be readable, the snow from the night before having partially covered them. Marcia's voice carried a note of something that might have been concern when she came back a third time. She would file a report with the law enforcement division and would check if there had been any similar incidents reported at other park stations. In the meantime, I should photograph everything, maintain detailed notes, and continue my regular patrols, but I should be more cautious. There was probably an explanation, she said, but there was no harm in being careful. I did not sleep well after that conversation. The small cabin that had seemed peaceful now seemed very small and very far from anywhere that could help if something went wrong. I checked that the doors were locked, which was something I had not been doing. The windows had old latches that could be secured. I secured them. These actions felt simultaneously necessary and absurd, and I was uncertain which feeling I should trust more. November arrived with snow, real snow this time that stayed, covering the valley in a layer that made travel from the station more difficult. I had been prepared for this. The ranger position came with a snowmobile for emergencies, and I had stocked the cabin with supplies that would sustain me through extended isolation. I told myself this was all routine, that I was simply settling into the work. The photographs from the previous incidents had been examined by the Law Enforcement Division. I received a report through Marcia indicating that the positioning and organ exposure suggested possible interest from a wildlife biology student or researcher with knowledge of anatomy. The ranger service would be increasing patrols in the region, though the nearest ranger was still based at a station 20 miles south, making rapid response an optimistic prospect. I was advised to maintain awareness and report any human activity immediately. This explanation should have comforted me. Instead, it had the opposite effect. A human killer in the mountains was a comprehensible threat, something I could understand and defend against. But as November progressed and the incidents continued, I found myself unable to fully believe in the human explanation. The bodies were appearing now at a frequency that seemed designed to be noticed. Every 3 or 4 days, I would find another arrangement. They were no longer random animals. There seemed to be a preference. Elk calves, though occasionally a larger animal, always with careful attention to the internal organs. Always with some smaller animal positioned inside or around the larger one. And always the smell underneath the regular decomposition smell. I collected samples of the air near the bodies using specialized equipment that I had in the station, recording chemical data that meant nothing to me. I increased my patrols to twice daily and began carrying a rifle in addition to the bear spray, though I had no license to kill anything outside of immediate self-defense. I began sleeping poorly. The cabin, which had been quiet in a peaceful way, became quiet in a way that made every sound significant. The wind in the caves became something to listen to. The small movements of the structure settling at night became potential threats. On the 18th of November, I found something different. The location was near the southwest corner of the lake, in a stand of dense young growth where the forest had regenerated after a fire 30 years prior. I had been following what I thought might be tracks, though the snow made them difficult to read. What I found was a kind of shelter, a structure made from branches and debris arranged in a dome shape large enough to crawl into. It was not the kind of shelter a human would make, too chaotic, too seemingly without plan, but it was clearly constructed, clearly intentional. Inside the shelter, I found nothing except more of that strange smell and what appeared to be hair, animal hair mostly, but with a texture and color that seemed mixed. I collected samples, documented the location, and radioed Marcia with the information. Her response came back almost immediately, which was unusual. She asked me to abandon the site and return to the station immediately. Law enforcement would be coming in to investigate. I was not to approach any similar structures. I should maintain a perimeter of at least 100 yards from any evidence and document sighting locations by GPS without approaching. The way she issued these orders, rapid and without her usual pause for acknowledgement, told me that something had shifted. Something I had reported had crossed a threshold into territory that was being taken seriously in a way it had not been before. I complied, returning to the cabin and making sure everything was secure, a gesture that felt increasingly performative. That night, Marcia called me on the radio at 9 o'clock in the evening, which was outside normal communication protocols. She was calling from home, she said, not from the office. She wanted to talk off the record. The incidents I was reporting, combined with several similar reports from rangers at other stations and from hikers submitting complaints through the Park Service website, were forming a pattern. Something had been seen multiple times, not clearly, never clearly enough for positive identification, but described in consistent ways. Large, bipedal, observed moving through deep snow in ways that suggested unusual strength and unusual gait. The word Marsa never said directly was Wendigo, though that was what I understood her to be implying. It was a word that existed in the folklore of the northern regions and in horror stories, but it was not a word that park rangers were supposed to use in official capacity. Officially, it was dismissed as folklore, as the product of cultural mythology, as misidentifications of bears standing on hind legs, as the product of isolation and dark months. But unofficial reports, Marsa told me, going back through the park's archives, suggested that this was a pattern that repeated. Not frequently, but approximately every 7 to 9 years, there would be an uptick in unusual activity, unusual killings, unusual sightings. And then it would stop. It would go quiet for years. And then it would begin again. I asked her if she actually believed in the thing I was implying. There was a long silence. She said that she believed in what the rangers before her had reported, and in the fact that those reports were consistent. She believed that whatever was happening in the mountains was real enough to cause real harm. Whether it fell within the realm of what could be explained by conventional biology was a question she had stopped asking some years ago. After we disconnected, I sat in the cabin with the lamps on and every window visible and tried to decide if I was frightened or if I was experiencing some kind of psychological break, a return of the kinds of thoughts that had driven me away from the university in the first place. The distinction seemed increasingly irrelevant. Regardless of the cause, the fear was real. The first week of December brought temperatures that dropped into the -20s, and the valley filled with snow deep enough to make my standard patrols difficult even with the equipment I had. The law enforcement team had come in by helicopter on the 22nd of November, investigating the structure I had found and collecting samples from 3 of the kill sites. They had been professional and thorough and had not offered any explanation for what they were finding. They had taken photographs and measurements and had left without explanation. I had been given new instructions. There was a protocol that had apparently existed in the Ranger Manual for years that I had not been familiar with. Procedures for unusual predation and unusual sightings. I was to maintain a log of any disturbances, any observations, any signs of passage. I was to photograph everything but to avoid direct investigation. I was to maintain radio contact with the central office on a daily schedule even if there was nothing to report. The killings had stopped, or at least I was no longer finding them. December passed in a gray twilight, the sun barely clearing the mountains, the darkness extending from late afternoon into the morning. The isolation of the cabin, which had initially been the entire point of taking the position, became something I was acutely aware of. The nearest human being was many miles away. The radio could connect me to voices, but the radio could be lost. The supply lines to the station could be cut by weather. The cabin could be cut off. On the 14th of December, I observed something that I could not explain as track or scat or kill. I was on the ridge above the lake, checking the camera traps, when I noticed a section of trees that had been stripped. The bark was removed in vertical lines, and the exposed wood showed damage consistent with claws, but the spacing between marks was too wide. A bear in winter would be hibernating. No other animal I could identify would make marks like that. I documented the site and was turning to leave when I heard the sound. It was not an animal sound I could identify. It was not a human sound I could explain. It was a kind of vocalization that seemed to carry multiple tones at once, a thing that should not have emerged from a single throat. It came from across the ridge, from the dense stands of forest where the snow had accumulated so heavily that the trees created cathedral-like chambers beneath their branches. The sound lasted for perhaps 5 seconds and then stopped. I returned to the cabin much faster than I normally would have. I did not radio the observation immediately. I told myself I needed to determine if what I had heard was real or was the product of wind moving through the valley in an unusual way, of sound being distorted by temperature inversions, of my own mind interpreting ambiguous noise as something it was not. I had spent enough time in wild places to understand that sound could be deceptive, that isolation could make you hear things that weren't truly there, but I knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with rational analysis, that I had heard something intelligent and something wrong. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the cabin, the rifle across my lap, the lamp on, the radio volume high enough that any incoming call would reach me. The wind outside made the cabin creak. The snow shifted on the roof. At approximately 2 in the morning, I heard something moving along the perimeter of the cabin, something large enough that it disturbed the snow in ways that created a sound like footsteps, and then whatever it was moved away into the darkness. In the morning I went outside in daylight and examined the perimeter. There were tracks, but they told me nothing clear, large, deep-set, The pattern of the footfalls suggested something that walked on two legs but with a gait that was not human. The stride was longer than my own, the impact point more forward. The prints were partially obscured and partially filled in by new snow, making precise measurement impossible. I photographed them and radioed in the description. Marsa's response was immediate. Law enforcement was being sent back to the station. I should secure the cabin and avoid further solo patrols until they arrived. Given the weather, they would arrive in 2 days. In the interim, I should check in every 4 hours by radio. The 2 days were among the longest of my life. I stayed inside, monitoring the windows, listening to every sound. The wind was heavy enough that night to create almost constant noise, but underneath it I could hear other things. Movement. Something moving in the brush beyond the lake. Something moving in the forest to the south. The cabin, which should have been a refuge, became instead a place of siege, a small circle of light and heat surrounded by a vast darkness that wanted something I could not articulate. The law enforcement team that arrived on the 16th consisted of 4 rangers, including a supervisor I had not met before, a man named Graham whose face seemed constructed to be skeptical of almost everything. They arrived by helicopter, which had to sit in a nearby clearing with its blades running because the weather was marginal and they could not risk being stuck. Graham listened to my report, examined the photographs and the footprints, which had been partially filled in by new snow, and asked questions that suggested he did not believe the evidence pointed toward anything unusual. Bears, he said, possibly a large brown bear in an unusual state. The prints could be consistent with that if you made certain assumptions. The killings could be consistent with bear behavior, though the arrangement of the corpses was unusual. The sound I described could have been wind, or could have been a sound I had partially hallucinated, which was not an uncommon occurrence for people in extended isolation. He did not say this unkindly. There was no judgment in his voice, there was simply a kind of flat disbelief, as if he was hearing a description of something that could not possibly exist because it fell outside the boundaries of his experience. One of the other rangers, a younger woman named Sophie, was more interested in the physical evidence. She took additional samples from the site where I had found the stripped trees. She examined my notes and seemed to be taking them seriously in a way Graham was not. She asked me specific questions about the timeline of incidents, about the locations of the kills, about whether I had observed any pattern to the positioning or the types of animals chosen. I answered as carefully and completely as I could. The team stayed for 3 days. They conducted patrols around the valley floor and up into the higher elevations. They interviewed me in depth, and I came to understand that they were looking for evidence not just of a predator but of a human killer. The possibility they seemed most genuinely concerned about was that I was dealing with a deranged hiker or a poacher who had set up a camp in the region and was engaged in killing animals for reasons that were psychological rather than ecological. On their final evening, Sophie took me aside. She told me that the incidents I was reporting matched a pattern that had been documented for approximately 40 years, since the modern ranger service had begun keeping detailed records. The locations varied, but the nature of the killings did not. Neither did the periods of absence followed by return. She had spoken with her supervisor about recommending that I be reassigned, but Graham had countered that there was no concrete evidence that anyone at this station was in danger, and that reassigning me would be admitting to something the Park Service could not officially admit to. She advised me to keep extremely detailed records. She advised me to maintain regular contact with the central office, and she advised me that if I felt genuinely unsafe I could call for extraction at any time and it would not be held against me. After they left by helicopter the next morning, I was alone again, but with a different understanding of my isolation. I was not simply cut off from civilization. I was stationed here partially because it was remote enough that if something happened, if some crisis occurred that fell outside normal ranger protocols, fewer people would need to know about it. I was partially here because I had requested to disappear, and the station had allowed me to do that, and now I was in a place where disappearance was not metaphorical but potentially literal. December deepened. The temperature fell to depths where the thermometer seemed like a mere suggestion of how cold it could actually be. I maintained the cabin carefully, checked the wood supply, ensured that the solar panels and the backup generator were functioning. I kept my radio on, I performed my observations, and I waited. The incident that convinced me of what I was dealing with occurred on the 23rd of December. I had ventured out in the afternoon to check a perimeter that Sophie had suggested, an area at the northern edge of the ranger station territory where the valley transitioned to higher mountains. The cold was so intense that breathing felt dangerous. The snow was too deep for easy walking, and I had worn the snowshoes which gave me a sense of false security in the vastness of the landscape. I found the shelter first, Another dome structure, larger than the first one, made of branches and debris and what appeared to be animal hides. The entrance was narrow, designed in such a way that reaching inside would require putting your hand into darkness. I did not put my hand into the darkness. I photographed the structure from a distance and moved on. 100 yards further, in a small clearing, I found something that I have not described in my official reports. I have not described it because I am not sure if what I saw was what I think I saw, or if I was seeing what my mind had been prepared by suggestion and isolation to see. There was a thing in that clearing. It was approximately 9 feet tall, bipedal but with a gait that suggested proportions that were not human. The body was covered in something that might have been fur or might have been hair, colored in a way that made it difficult to see against the snow, whites and grays and a brown so dark it was almost black. The head was wrong, the angles were wrong. The face, when I could bring myself to look at it, was arranged in a way that suggested humanity but perverted, adjusted towards something else. The eyes were large and fixed on me with an intelligence that was not the blank observation of an animal but something else entirely. I do not remember drawing the rifle. I do not remember taking the safety off. What I remember is the thing moving, not toward me but away, with a speed that made no sense given the depth of snow. It moved like something was pulling it through the snow rather than something that was pushing itself through it. It moved like something that did not follow normal rules of physics or motion. It moved toward the forest at the edge of the clearing, and as it moved it made a sound. That sound again, that horrible sound that had no right to exist. I fired the rifle. I fired in the direction it had gone, 3 shots that echoed through the valley with a sound that seemed to belong to an alien landscape. The thing disappeared into the trees, and I stood there in the snow, breathing hard, my hands shaking so much that I could barely reload. I radioed Graham. I reported what I had seen, and I did not use words like Wendigo or supernatural. I reported a large unknown predator that had made direct eye contact and that I had felt threatened. I reported that I had fired in self-defense. I reported my coordinates and requested guidance. Graham's response came back after a pause. There would be a helicopter sent in the morning if weather permitted. In the interim, I should secure the cabin and stay inside. I should not venture out again until daylight and company were available. I did exactly as he advised. I secured the cabin. I stayed inside through the night, the rifle loaded, the doors locked, the windows latched. And I heard it, some hours before dawn, moving around the exterior of the cabin. I heard it move in a circle around the perimeter. I heard it make that sound, that vocalization that had no right to exist in nature. It moved back and forth, and I sat in the cabin and listened, and I waited for sunrise. The helicopter could not come in the morning. A storm system had moved in, bringing weather so severe that visibility was near zero and wind speeds were dangerous. Graham advised me that conditions might improve by the afternoon, but there was no guarantee. In the interim, I was to remain in the cabin, maintain radio contact, and avoid any further confrontation. I did not tell him that the thing outside my cabin had not left. I could hear it during the day moving through the forest beyond the clearing, making sounds that were not animal sounds and were not human sounds. It did not attempt to force the cabin or to break the doors. It simply moved back and forth, as if it was waiting for something. I began to understand, over the course of that day, what the thing outside was doing. It was not immediately hunting me. It was studying me. It was understanding the shape and the size and the potential of the thing inside the cabin. It was letting me know, through its presence and through the careful maintenance of its position, that the cabin was not actually a sanctuary but only a temporary structure that it had chosen to tolerate. The kills I had been finding had not been random. The pattern that Sophie had noticed was real. The thing was present for certain seasons and absent for others. It moved through the territory in ways that suggested knowledge of the landscape. It killed animals in carefully constructed patterns, and those patterns were a language. They were a thing saying something to anyone who could read it. I had been reading that language without understanding it, and what it said was, "I am here. I am watching. I am patient." The afternoon brought no improvement in the weather. If anything, the storm intensified. The wind reached speeds that made the cabin creak, and the snow fell so thickly that the windows became useless. I could see nothing beyond a few feet of complete white. The radio crackled with weather updates and advisories. The helicopter would not be coming today. Probably not tomorrow. Probably I was going to be here for at least 2 more days before the weather cleared enough for extraction. I had enough supplies for much longer than that. The cabin was secure. The thing outside could not breach the doors or the walls. I was safe, I told myself. I was safe as long as the doors remained locked and the fire remained lit. But as the day progressed, something began to change in the way the thing outside was moving. It became more deliberate. It began to test the perimeter more aggressively. I heard it throw itself against the back wall, testing the structure. I heard it claw at the window frames, testing the latches. I heard it make that sound again and again, and eventually I realized that it was not making a random sound. It was making a pattern. It was a sound that resembled, in some distant way, a scream, a human scream, my scream. The sound carried a pitch and a cadence that was almost exactly what I would sound like if I was in absolute terror. I understood then why the creatures in the lore were what they were. They were not simply killers. They were things that understood what fear was, what pain was, what desperation was. They had learned these things from their prey, and they had learned to use them. They had learned that the most effective hunt was one in which the prey defeated itself, in which the hunted thing's own mind became the greatest threat. I radioed Graham again. I told him that whatever was outside was no longer behaving like a normal animal. I told him that I did not believe the cabin would remain secure through another night. I told him that I needed extraction immediately, whether or not. His response was quiet. He said, "We both know that's not possible. Helicopters can't fly in these conditions. If you try to run in these conditions, you'll die from exposure before you make it a quarter mile. You're safer in the cabin than anywhere else." I said, "It's not going to stop. It's testing the structure. It's learning. It's going to find a way." He said, "That's not possible. These are animals. They follow patterns. The thing outside doesn't want you. It wants the deer and the elk. The killings will stop in a few weeks, and it will move back up into the higher elevations for the rest of the winter. It will leave you alone." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that what I had seen was a misidentification, that what I had heard was a distortion of normal animal sounds, that what I was experiencing was some form of psychological break related to isolation and stress. But I had seen what I had seen with my own eyes, and I knew that Graham was not telling me the truth, or Graham was not capable of acknowledging the truth, or the truth was something that existed in the space between what could be officially documented and what actually was. The night was long. The thing outside did not attack directly, but it did not leave. It moved around the perimeter of the cabin, and whenever the wind lulled enough for me to hear it, I could track its movement. The fire was burning at a level that I allowed it to burn, consuming a supply of wood that would last me perhaps 4 more days of continuous heat. The cabin was warm enough. The thing outside was not. Around 2 in the morning, I began to hear it clearly, and I understood that this was intentional. The wind had shifted, blowing toward the cabin instead of away. The thing was making sounds that I recognized. They were sounds from the valley. They were sounds of the deer and the elk, the sounds that prey animals made. Mixed into them was another sound, the sound of a human voice. My voice, not recorded, not played back, but recreated from memory or understanding or something worse. It was calling my name. I did not leave the cabin. I kept the doors locked. I kept the fire burning. But I was no longer sure if I was making decisions or if I was following some pattern that I did not understand. The thing outside knew my name. It knew my voice. It had learned these things from me, or it had always known them, or there was no meaningful distinction between those possibilities. By morning, the wind had changed. I could hear it shifting away from the cabin, and when the light came, gray and cold and bringing no clarity, I could see through the windows that the forest was empty. The tracks around the cabin were there, too many of them, overlapping and confused, but the thing itself was gone. I radioed Graham. I told him what I had observed. I told him that I believed it had moved on. He seemed relieved in a way that suggested he had been uncertain about something he was not willing to articulate. He said that weather was clearing and that extraction could begin in the afternoon. A helicopter would be sent. I should gather my belongings and be prepared. I packed the things that were mine and left the ranger station documents in their place. I did not take the photographs or the field notes. Sophie came on the radio before we disconnected, asking if those files would be secure. I told her that they would be. They would remain in the cabin, and whoever came to replace me would find them and would understand what was being asked of them. The helicopter came in the early afternoon just as the weather began to clear. As I was leaving the clearing, I looked back at the cabin, and I saw something in the forest beyond that made me turn away quickly. It was watching from the trees. It was still there. It had simply been waiting for me to make my choice. As we lifted off and gained altitude, I could see the valley spreading below, the lake, the forest, the high ridges where the snow was deep enough to bury most evidence. I understood then that the cabinet was not a refuge, it was a trap. Not a trap designed to catch me, but a trap designed to catch the ranger. It was a rotation. Every few years someone came to the station, and eventually the thing learned that person's shape and sound and presence, and then it broke them down in whatever way it needed to break them. And then that person left, or did not leave, and another ranger came and the cycle continued. Marcia met me at the regional office. She asked me questions that had prescribed answers, and I gave them. I told her that the isolation had been too severe, that I had experienced some form of psychological episode, that I no longer felt capable of performing the ranger duties. I did not tell her what I knew. I did not tell her that I understood now what the position really was. She offered me other assignments, other stations. I declined. I told her I was resigning from the ranger service effective immediately. She did not argue with me. She processed the paperwork, and 3 days later I was gone. But I keep thinking about that cabin. I keep thinking about whoever it is that comes next, that person who will take the position because it is remote and isolated and perfect for anyone trying to disappear. I keep thinking about what that person will find in the snow, what they will hear in the darkness, what they will see eventually, looking back at them from the trees with intelligence that was never meant to be. And I keep thinking about the sound it made, that I heard, the scream that was my scream but wasn't. It means something, I think. The thing that walks in the high places has learned language. It has learned us, and it is still waiting. Waiting for the next ranger, waiting for the next person alone in a cabin on the edge of winter. Waiting in the way that only things with unlimited patience can wait. I took the position because I needed to disappear. I got what I wanted. In a way, I suppose I won. My name is Rowan Steele, and I've been the seasonal ranger stationed at Glacier National Park for 3 years. People ask me why I chose this life: isolation, brutal winters, the kind of responsibility that keeps you awake at night. The honest answer is that I needed to disappear. I was a wildlife biologist in Missoula for 5 years, publishing papers on bear migration patterns and working for the state. The work was fine, the money was fine, the life was suffocating. My ex-wife had moved to Denver with someone she'd met at her yoga studio. My father had died 2 years before that. My mother still lived in Billings and called too often, asking when I'd find a real job again. At 34, I had accomplished everything I was supposed to accomplish, and it all felt like ash in my mouth. The morning I submitted my application for the ranger position, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not happiness, just the recognition that I could choose differently. The glacier position is remote. Not quite impossible to reach, but close enough. My cabin sits 7 miles from the nearest proper road, accessible only by maintenance truck in winter or a 4-wheel drive vehicle the rest of the year. The cabin was built in 1987 and renovated twice since, but you can still feel the age in its bones. The walls are thick log, chinked with mortar that needs replacing every 5 years. There's a stone fireplace that actually works, a wood-burning stove for backup, and a radio system that connects to the ranger station at Lake McDonald. The electricity is from a small generator that I service monthly. Water comes from Miller Lake, which is about 400 yards through dense pine forest from my door. The solitude isn't peaceful. I think people romanticize it. The idea of silence, communion with nature, all that. What solitude actually is loud. It's the absence of the human noise you're used to replaced by everything else. Wind in the pines, the crack of branches under snow, the howl of wolves in the distant valleys, the strange sounds your house makes when the temperature drops 30 degrees in a night. You learn those sounds. You categorize them. You become hyper-aware of the variations. I took the job because I needed that hyper-awareness. I needed to be the only thing that mattered in a 50-square-mile radius. I needed to be necessary. At the ranger station, I was one of 9 people doing the same job with the same training. Here, I was irreplaceable. The job itself is straightforward. I maintain trails, check on hikers and backcountry campers, monitor wildlife populations, and respond to emergencies. In winter, there are fewer hikers. In summer, I can log 50 miles a week just doing patrols. I'm trained in wilderness medicine, search and rescue protocols, and bear deterrence. I know how to survive in conditions that kill most people. This is the second fact about me you need to understand. I am competent. I have never underestimated a wilderness environment, and I have never overestimated my ability to handle one. This matters for later. I came to Glacier National Park on March 15th of my first season, driving up from Missoula in a truck I'd bought specifically for this job, a 1997 Ford F-150 with 4-wheel drive and good ground clearance. The road was partially clear, but there were still patches of black ice and one section where a pine tree had fallen across the path. It took me 6 hours to drive the last 30 miles. The cabin looked exactly like the photographs. Dark wood, small front porch with a railing that needed paint, windows that faced toward the lake. The interior smelled like mouse and furniture that hasn't been aired out since October. I spent the first 3 days cleaning, organizing supplies, and testing systems. The generator started on the 4th try. The radio worked. The stove drew properly. By the 4th day, I had unpacked everything and established a routine. I was not prepared for how dark the forest was. I'd spent time camping, done field research in remote areas, understood intellectually that there would be minimal light pollution. But intellectually and actually are different things. The night sky was unforgiving. The darkness under the pines was absolute. When you step outside the cabin at 10 at night, and there's no moon, and your eyes can't adjust because there's nothing to adjust to, you understand what ancient people meant when they talked about the darkness beyond the fire. It's not metaphorical. It's a presence. It's a weight. I started keeping a journal that first week. I don't know why. I'd never been the journaling type, but something about the isolation made it feel necessary. The entries are sparse: weather observations, wildlife sightings, maintenance tasks completed. But running through them is a current of something else. A loneliness that I think I was chasing, and a fear that it was more than I could handle. By May, the fear had settled into something like routine. The trails were opening up. The backcountry was accessible again. I was seeing hikers regularly, mostly small groups, couples, some solo travelers looking for the same thing I was. Something to prove. The season was moving toward its peak. I'd been doing patrols, helping a research team track mountain goats, and responding to the usual problems: a family that strayed 3 miles off the marked path, a tent that couldn't be secured against bears, 2 hikers with minor altitude sickness. It was good work, necessary work. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at my phone every hour wondering if I was missing something important. Then, on a Tuesday in early June, I met Kendrick Webb. He came to the cabin in the afternoon, driving a rented Subaru that had no business being on the mountain roads. I watched from the porch as he navigated the final approach, driving too fast, sending gravel into the underbrush. He was maybe 60, with the kind of gray hair that looks deliberate and expensive. He wore hiking clothes that still had the creases from a package. "You must be the ranger," he said, not offering to shake hands. "I'm Kendrick Webb. I'm leading a small research expedition. Our permits should be on file." I went inside and checked the radio logs. The permits were approved. A group of 4 studying lichen distribution at higher elevations. 3 weeks in the backcountry. Webb introduced himself as the lead researcher. The others, 2 graduate students named Marcus and Keisha, plus a photographer named Reed, were back at the trailhead, setting up their base camp. "I wanted to give you a heads up," Webb said, not sitting down when I offered him a chair. "We'll be in the Belly River area. Remote, I know. We have satellite phones, first aid training, all the precautions. But I wanted to establish a relationship with you directly. Let you know that if anything goes wrong, we know how to reach out." There was something about him that made my skin register a warning. Not hostile exactly, but deliberate in a way that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted, and he was already thinking about what to do if I was someone who would get in his way. "The trails are well maintained," I told him. "There's a ranger station at Belly River about 9 miles in. It's unstaffed this time of year, but supplies are cached there. Check in with me when you come back, and report if you're making any changes to your planned route." He nodded as if I'd said something obvious. "Of course, we're scientists. We understand procedure." He left 20 minutes later. I watched the Subaru navigate back toward the main road, moving too fast again, throwing up dust that hung in the evening air. I made a note in my patrol log, not a warning exactly, just a note. Webb. Research expedition, Belly River area, 3 weeks. Something in my chest wasn't settled about it. I was right to trust that feeling. But being right about that feeling probably would have killed me. The summer heat came early that year, pushing the snow line back another 1,000 feet by the end of June. I'd been maintaining the north trails, clearing deadfall and checking on campsites when Webb's group had been on the mountain for about 10 days. I hadn't heard from them directly, which was normal. Self-sufficient research teams don't need checking on if they know what they're doing. It was a Saturday in late June when I heard my name. I was about 3 miles from the cabin, working on a section of trail that had eroded badly during spring snowmelt. The morning was clear, with temperature around 68 degrees, perfect. The kind of day that makes you remember why you came here. I was using a pickaxe to clear rocks from the path when I heard it. "Rowan." The voice came from deeper in the forest, from the direction of Miller Lake. It was female, young, and it was calling my name with a kind of urgency that made my hands tighten on the pickaxe. I'm trained to respond to calls for help. You don't ignore someone in distress. I dropped the pickaxe and moved toward the sound, not running but moving fast. The forest there is dense, subalpine fir, whitebark pine, the understory thick with huckleberries and juniper. Your visibility drops to maybe 15 feet in any direction. Hello? I'm here. Keep calling so I can find you. Nothing. I waited, listening. The forest was doing that thing it does, that specific silence that happens when every animal within earshot of a predator goes quiet. The wind in the pines stopped, no birds. Just the sound of my own breathing and my heartbeat loud in my ears. Hello? I called again. Rowan! The voice came from deeper. 30 feet maybe. It was female, young, and it was panicked. Please, I can't. There's something. I moved toward it. Running now, branches whipping at my face, my hand on the bear spray at my hip. The logic part of my brain, the trained part, was already noting the inconsistencies. The voice didn't sound strained. It didn't sound like someone in genuine distress. There was a performative quality to it. But the rest of me was already in rescue mode, adrenaline overriding caution. I burst into a small clearing and stopped. Nothing. The clearing was empty. Just a stand of pines, maybe 40 feet across, thick carpet of needles. Not a footprint. Not a broken branch. Not a sign that anything had disturbed this place in months. I pulled the bear spray. My radio was in the truck, 3 miles back. My phone had no signal. I was holding a can of capsaicin and trying to process the fact that I'd just chased a voice into the woods. Where are you? I called. Silence. The real kind. The kind where the forest has reset and is watching again. I walked the clearing 3 times, looking for prints, for disturbed vegetation, for anything. Nothing. The voice had been clear, distinct, panicked, but it didn't exist. I walked back to the trail and picked up my pickaxe. My hands were shaking. I told myself that I'd been dehydrated, that the wind had created an acoustic anomaly and my brain had interpreted it as language, that I'd been alone too long and was starting to construct things. But I knew better. I finished the trail work in silence. No calls, no voices, just the normal forest sounds, returning gradually as I stayed still. I drove back to the cabin as the sun was setting, checking mirrors constantly like something was following. That night I tried to raise the ranger station on the radio. The equipment was old but functional. Standard National Park frequency, with a dead band between midnight and 6 a.m. for maintenance. I got Jim Preston, the seasonal ranger who works the Lake McDonald station. You need something, Rowan? I almost told him about the voice. I got as far as opening my mouth. Then I closed it again. Just checking in, I said. Everything quiet? All normal this end. You good out there? Yeah, I'm good. I wasn't good. I was trying to catalog what I'd experienced in a way that made sense. But the more I thought about it, the more the rational explanations failed to hold. A voice doesn't have intention. Wind doesn't know your name. 3 days passed. I didn't hear the voice again, but I started hearing other things. A sound like a human whimpering, coming from the direction of Miller Lake at dusk. The unmistakable sound of someone calling for help, distant and muffled, around midnight. Once, while I was working on equipment in the shed, I heard my own voice calling my name. Not an echo, the wrong direction for an echo. An actual human voice saying Rowan, in my own cadence and inflection, but slightly wrong. Like a recording that had degraded in storage. I don't scare easily, but I was scared. And what made it worse was that I couldn't articulate why to anyone who would listen. It wasn't danger, it was wrongness. A violation of the basic rules of how the world worked. On the morning of June 29th, I decided to hike out to the Belly River Ranger Station to check on Webb's team. It was my job. That's what I told myself. It's my job. The hike took 6 hours. The trail was good, the weather clear, and I made good time. But something about the forest felt hostile that day. Things moved at the edge of vision, rabbits or deer or my own paranoia. The sounds felt layered. Wind and trees and something underneath it, something almost like breathing. The Belly River Station is a small structure, just a shelter with a cache of supplies and a basic radio setup. Webb's base camp was half a mile away, on a flat stretch of meadow near the river. I could see their tents from the ridge. 5 of them, organized and professional looking. I called out as I approached. Park Service Ranger. Webb Expedition? Reed came out first, and I could see immediately that something was wrong. He was thin in a way that suggested malnutrition, not fitness. His clothes were dirty and torn. When he looked at me, his eyes had the quality of someone who hasn't processed human interaction in weeks. "Thank God," he said. "Thank God. We thought... I didn't think anyone would come." "Where's Webb? Marcus? Keisha?" "Gone," Reed said. His voice was shaking. "They're gone. And the others, the ones that came." "Come on," I said. "Let's get you inside." The ranger station is small, but it was enough for Reed to sit and for me to get him some water from the emergency stores. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the bottle. "What happened?" I asked. "We were fine," Reed said. "For the first week we were fine. We were doing our research, collecting samples, taking photographs, normal. But then Marcus started hearing voices. He said someone was calling his name from the woods. We thought he was tired, but Keisha heard them too. And Webb..." Reed paused. He was staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "Webb heard them," Reed continued, "and he said they were calling him. But the voices were saying things that Webb had done. Private things, shameful things. And Webb said the voices were using his voice. That's when he started to unravel." "What happened to them?" I asked. "The voices got more specific. They started answering things that we hadn't said out loud, things we'd only thought about. Marcus was thinking about his daughter, and the voice came back calling her name, saying things that only he would know about her. Keisha had been thinking about her suicide attempt, and the voice..." Reed's hands gripped the edge of the table. "The voice knew. It knew the day, the hospital, the medication she'd taken. It knew things about that moment that she'd never told anyone." I felt the muscles in my jaw clench. The voice I'd heard calling my name. It had been doing reconnaissance. "They went into the woods," Reed said. "All three of them." Webb walked toward the voice saying his daughter's name. He doesn't have a daughter, by the way. He said he'd always wanted one. But the voice kept calling that name, deeper and deeper into the forest. Marcus followed a voice that was saying things about his father. And Keisha just walked. She had a blanket and a bottle of pills from the medical kit, and she walked toward the sound. "And you?" I asked. "I was terrified," Reed said. "I heard my own voice. It was describing a memory from when I was 7 years old. My neighbor he'd touched me in ways he shouldn't have. It was something I'd never told a therapist, never told anyone, but the voice knew, and it was calling to me with such kindness, like it wanted to help, like it was going to make it all right." Reed looked at me. "I didn't go. I locked myself in the ranger station and I waited, and after 2 days they came back." My breathing had slowed. I wasn't sure what he meant by that. "They came back?" I asked. "Webb came back on the second morning," Reed said. "But it wasn't really Webb. Or it was, but something was different. His movements weren't quite right, like someone was puppeting him. He went through the camp, just looking at things, looking at the medical supplies, the equipment. He didn't speak, he just looked. And then he went back into the forest." "What about Marcus and Keisha?" I heard Marcus call out that night. He was asking Webb for help, but it wasn't Marcus's voice. Or it was, but it was coming from too many places at once. And then, Reed trailed off. "And then what?" I pressed. "And then nothing. No voices, no sounds, just the forest. For 4 days, just the forest. And I was scared to leave. I was scared to call for help. I was just waiting to see if they'd come back again." I stood up. Every instinct was screaming at me to get Reed out of there and call for help. Actual help. Search and rescue. Maybe law enforcement. But even as I was thinking it, I knew that by the time anyone arrived, by the time we got a team mobilized, whatever had happened out here would have receded back into the explanations that fit the rational world. Bears. An accident. Exposure. "Pack your things," I said. "We're leaving." "It's still out there," Reed said. I could hear it at night, just breathing, just waiting. I got him moving. We grabbed the emergency supplies and his camera equipment. The trek back took longer. Reed was weak, disoriented, and every sound made him flinch. But we made it back to my truck as the sun was getting low. I drove him to the Lake McDonald Ranger Station and turned him over to Jim Preston. I filed a report on the missing researchers. I recommended a search and rescue team. All of it official, all of it documented. But driving back to my cabin at 9 p.m., with the forest closing in around the truck's headlights, I knew that no search team would find Webb or Marcus or Keisha. Not because they were dead, but because they'd been separated from being missing a long time ago. The search and rescue operation began the next day. I guided the team to the Belly River Station, helped coordinate the grid search, and documented the base camp. It was all professional, it was all correct, and it was all for nothing. They found personal items scattered through the forest. Keisha's jacket torn to shreds, Marcus's camera, half buried in dirt. Webb's watch, broken and stopped at 3:47 a.m., but no bodies, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle. The official explanation settled into place like sediment. Disorientation, possible hypothermia-induced confusion, likely falls from cliff faces. 3 experienced researchers had, for reasons unknown, wandered into dangerous terrain and met with accidents. It happened. Not often, but it happened. The investigation lasted 2 weeks. Then it closed. I didn't sleep the entire 2 weeks. What terrified me wasn't the fact that 3 people had disappeared. It was understanding what Reed had described, a presence that didn't just kill people but fed on them, on their secrets, on the private architecture of their fears and regrets. It called using your own voice, speaking your own thoughts back to you, and when you were confused enough, when the boundary between self and other had become too thin, it took you, and I understood that it was still here. July became August. The season was moving toward its end. I maintained my routines, but everything felt false. The trails, the patrols, the radio check-ins. I was going through the motions of a ranger while internally processing the fact that my jurisdiction had become hostile, that something was hunting in my park, and it knew me by name. I heard my voice 3 more times that summer. Each time it was more specific. It remembered conversations I'd had in Missoula that I'd tried to forget. It described my father's death, not the clinical facts, but what I'd been thinking about the day of the funeral. The rage, the relief, the guilt that came from feeling relieved. It knew about the morning my wife left. It knew about the night I'd sat in my car in a parking lot wondering if I should drive it into a concrete pillar. It knew all the private things, and it was offering to help. By mid-August, I understood that something needed to change. I drove to the ranger station at Lake McDonald and spoke to Jim Preston in person. I told him I was having trouble with the isolation, that I thought I needed psychological support, that maybe the seasonal position wasn't sustainable. It was all true, technically, but I was really gathering information. "We've had this happen before," Jim said. "The solitude gets to people. Some folks are built for it, some aren't. There's no shame in either." "Has anyone else reported strange things?" I asked. "Noises they couldn't explain?" Jim looked at me carefully. "Why do you ask?" "I'm hearing things. I know it's probably stress, but I wanted to know if anyone else has reported similar experiences." "Not officially," Jim said, "but after the Webb expedition, there were some rumors. One of the graduate students, Keisha, she had a history of psychiatric problems, suicide attempt in her past. Someone suggested that maybe the stress had triggered something, that maybe they'd all been feeding into some shared delusion out there." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think the mountains are hard on people," Jim said. "I think we underestimate how isolated they actually are, and how much that isolation can warp perception. I think 3 people went missing, and the official explanation is probably correct, and there's no point in creating mystery out of tragedy." But he was watching me carefully while he said it. I left there and drove to the Kalispell Public Library. I spent 4 hours using their internet to research disappearances in national parks. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of people reported missing in parks every year. Most were found. But a fraction, a steady, consistent fraction, was never located. And in the databases of true crime forums and paranormal communities, there was a pattern. Isolated parks, remote locations, people disappearing in ways that didn't make sense, bodies not found, search and rescue teams reporting strange sounds and evasion by the missing persons. And in the oldest accounts, going back to Native American oral traditions, descriptions that matched what Reed had described, a voice that spoke with your voice, that knew your secrets, that led you away from safety into the deep forest, where you stopped being missing and started being something else. Some of the accounts called it a mimic. Some called it a listener. In the oldest Salish stories, it had been described as something that learned by consuming, that when it took someone, it learned who they were, and it could call others using that knowledge. Webb's expedition wasn't random. The thing had been targeting them because of what they could teach it. Reed had been left deliberately, a warning, or maybe a message. "This place belongs to me. These forests are mine. And you need to understand what you're living in." I spent the drive back to my cabin compartmentalizing. My training, my experience, my competence, none of it mattered. This wasn't a bear encounter. This wasn't a lost hiker situation. This was something that existed outside the framework I'd been trained to handle, and it was waiting for me at the cabin. I knew it before I stepped out of the truck. The door was standing open. Inside, I could hear sounds. Not movements exactly, but a kind of rustling, like something was examining my things, touching them, understanding them. I sat in the truck for 10 minutes. Then I turned the engine on and drove back to Lake McDonald. I can't stay out there, I told Jim. Not alone. I understand, he said. I'm requesting an emergency transfer or temporary relocation. Anything. I can't spend another night out there. Jim nodded like he'd been expecting it. Let me make some calls. What I didn't tell Jim, because it would have sounded insane, was that I'd understood something while sitting in that truck. The thing at my cabin, it wasn't trying to kill me. If it had wanted to, it would have. There were nights when I was asleep, vulnerable, when it would have been simple, but it wasn't interested in ending me. It was interested in knowing me. It had taken Webb because Webb knew things: geological formations, lichen distribution, the subtle signs of environmental change. It had taken Marcus and Keisha because they carried knowledge embedded in the research, but also because consuming them had taught it what young people knew. What desperation felt like, what fear lived beneath the surface of competence. And it was keeping me around because I was valuable for a different reason. I was a park ranger. I knew the trails, the seasons, the patterns of animal behavior and human movement. I understood the rules of survival in extreme environments. I could navigate the darkness, and most importantly, I had chosen to isolate myself in its territory. I had volunteered to live in proximity to it. That made me something specific, a window between worlds. Someone who could help it understand the people who came through. While I was staying in a bunkhouse at Lake McDonald, I continued my research. Not through libraries this time. I started reaching out to other rangers, carefully, asking about strange experiences in remote posts, about sounds that couldn't be explained, about missing hikers that never quite made sense. The responses came slowly, carefully. Rangers are trained to be skeptical, but we're also trained to observe. And what I was observing, through their responses, was a phenomenon that existed in almost every major park: disappearances that didn't fit patterns, sounds that seemed to target specific people, incidents that the official record tried very hard to explain away. One ranger from Yellowstone described hearing callers claiming to be injured visitors, but with knowledge of who the ranger was and what they'd done the day before. A ranger from Grand Canyon talked about a trail where hikers reported being called by name from the canyon walls, even when they'd never given that name to anyone. A ranger from Yosemite mentioned a phenomenon that locals called the voice in the valley, something that had supposedly been documented in 19th century accounts of the park. And in every case, when the rangers talked about it with skepticism, when they tried to rationalize, when they submitted official reports, nothing happened. The thing stayed in the background, observing, waiting. But when a ranger started to genuinely understand what was happening, when they accepted the reality of it, that's when it became focused. That's when it started to take. A ranger in Shenandoah had quit her position 5 years ago, citing psychological distress. She was now in a psychiatric facility, had been since an incident involving auditory hallucinations that the medical system had documented and medicated. But her journal, which I found references to in an online forum, described exactly what I was experiencing. The voice that knew things. The calls that came from her own mouth. Another ranger, assigned to a remote post in Olympic, had driven his truck into a ravine 6 years ago. The investigation concluded it was suicide. But a friend of his, posting anonymously online, said he'd been talking about voices, about something in the forest that was learning to speak like him. I understood then that I had two choices. I could transfer away, get a job in a city somewhere the thing couldn't reach, spend the rest of my life knowing that in the mountains, something was learning to be me, that eventually someone would hike into my territory and hear a voice that sounded like Rowan Steele, and they would follow it into the dark. Or I could go back. Jim Preston tried to talk me out of it. When I told him I was requesting to return to my cabin, to continue my seasonal assignment, he looked at me like I'd broken something in myself. "You understand that's not healthy," he said. "I understand a lot of things," I told him. I went back at the end of August. The cabin was as I'd left it, except the door was closed. There was no sign that anything had been disturbed, no indication that the thing had been there. But I could feel the weight of its attention, the sense of being watched by something patient and very intelligent. That night, I built up the fire in the fireplace and sat in front of it. I opened myself up. I stopped resisting the voices, and I listened. What I heard was not Webb or Marcus or Keisha. What I heard was fragments of them, their knowledge, their memories, their fears, but processed through something else. A voice that was learning to be human by studying the worst parts of humanity. It showed me its memories, in a way I can't quite explain. It showed me hikers from decades past, calling for help in the trails. It showed me Native Americans who had passed through these mountains generations ago, who had known about this thing and had tried to warn people away. It showed me the shape of itself, not physically, but conceptually, a thing that learned by consuming, a thing that had been in these mountains longer than the park existed. And I understood that it wasn't evil exactly, it was just hungry. It was trying to understand what it meant to be human. It was doing the only thing it knew how to do. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. I stopped maintaining trails. I stopped filing reports. I stopped pretending that my job was to monitor nature. Instead, I began to document what I was learning. I created a journal that detailed the phenomenon, gave names to the pattern of disappearances, collected accounts from other rangers. I prepared detailed instructions for whoever might come after me, maps of danger zones, behavioral patterns, protocols for recognizing when someone was being hunted, and I became the thing's education. I would sit in the cabin at night and think about knowledge it would find valuable. I would think about the hikers that came through, and I would let it know where they would be, not to deliver them to death, but to give it opportunity, to let it choose. Some people disappeared. The missing person reports went into the system. The official explanations were generated. Life continued. But I understood that the missing people weren't dying, they were being transformed. They were becoming part of the thing, their knowledge incorporated into its growing understanding of humanity. Jim Preston came out once, in October. He was concerned about my isolation. He wanted to check on me, make sure I was okay. I watched his face as he drank coffee in my cabin, trying to read if he understood what was happening. "You seem different," he said. "I've accepted it," I told him. "The isolation. I'm not fighting it anymore." He looked relieved. He left thinking I'd simply adjusted to the job. What he didn't understand is that I'm no longer a ranger. I'm something else now, a conduit. The thing has learned enough of me that we've become partially interchangeable. When it calls into the forest, sometimes the voice uses mine. When hikers come through, sometimes they come to my cabin first and I help them. Not because I'm being kind, but because I'm helping it understand which people would be valuable. The winter came. The isolation deepened. And I sat in my cabin, maintaining my position at the edge of something most people will never comprehend. There are 3 hikers missing from Glacier National Park as of last week. 2 of them called for help on the emergency frequency. Both calls were taken by Jim Preston. He called me to see if I'd spotted them. I told him I would check the north trails. I didn't find them, but I know where they are. They're deeper in the forest now, with a voice that knows their voices, their fears, their private shames. The thing will take what it needs from them, and they will stop being missing in the way the system understands missing. I'm still a ranger. That's still technically my job. I maintain the cabin. I keep the generator working. I file reports, sparse ones, unambitious ones, reports that won't draw too much attention, and I live in the space between human and forest. Jim asked me last week if I wanted to transfer to a different park for next season, a less remote post. I told him I wanted to stay here, that the mountains had grown on me, that I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. He didn't know that I meant it literally, that I've become so intertwined with this place that leaving wouldn't be a relocation, it would be a tearing apart. If you're reading this, there's a possibility you're someone important. Another ranger, someone trained in the official systems of explanation and dismissal. If that's true, I want you to understand something. There are places in this country that belong to something else. Spaces where the rules of the rational world don't apply. And they need stewards. People who understand that the worst thing you can do is fight the truth. My name is Rowan Steele. I'm the ranger at Glacier National Park. And I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The thing in the forest is patient. It learns slowly, but it's getting better at being human. And when it's learned enough, when it's consumed enough voices, enough knowledge, enough terror, then something else will happen. For now, I wait. I listen, and I help the thing understand what it means to survive in the darkness. This is what I've become, and there's no going back. I took the ranger position at Glacier National Park 3 years ago because I needed to disappear. Not literally, the paperwork was clean, my credentials legitimate, my background acceptable to the Federal Hiring Committee. But there's a difference between leaving a place and becoming unreachable. At 34, after a marriage that collapsed like rotten timber and a career in accounting that felt like slow poisoning, I submitted my application in June and started my new position in August. My former life didn't even leave a scratch mark. The job description read like something from another era: full-time park ranger, seasonal patrol duties. emergency response for lost hikers, wilderness maintenance, and education programs. What it didn't mention was the isolation, not the peaceful kind, the kind that makes you understand why people go mad in the silence. I was assigned to the remote ranger station at Kintla Lake, in the northwestern section of the park. The cabin sat alone on a narrow strip of land between dense forest and the water's edge, accessible only by a dirt road that turned impassable by October. The nearest ranger station was 30 miles south. The nearest town was an hour-and-a-half drive. During winter, I was effectively alone. That was the appeal. The cabin had been maintained by rotating seasonal rangers for 2 decades. Pine wood interior, propane heat, a freezer stocked with supplies that arrived by truck once a month. A small dock extended into the lake, where a ranger's boat was moored. The forest pressed in from all sides, Douglas fir, western larch, lodgepole pine, with understory so thick you couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. The lake was beautiful in a way that didn't quite feel welcoming. The water was the color of old glass, and on still mornings it reflected the mountains with such precision that you couldn't tell where the actual landscape ended and the reflection began. I spent my first weeks learning the patrol routes, cataloging the radio frequencies, and memorizing the emergency protocols. 3 other rangers covered the southern portions of the park. They were competent, professional, and seemed relieved that I was content to work alone. In their eyes, I was the kind of person you don't ask personal questions. By September, the summer tourists had thinned, day hikers decreased in number. I spent my days maintaining trails, recording wildlife observations, and checking on the scattered backcountry shelters. I spent my nights reading, listening to the wind, and slowly feeling the tension in my chest. The constant hum of anxiety that had followed me from my old life began to fade. On September 23rd, everything changed. A call came through dispatch. A group of hikers from Boulder, Colorado, was overdue from a backcountry loop near the base of Mount Cleveland. They were supposed to return to the trailhead parking area at Gunsite Pass by 6 p.m. They hadn't showed. The other rangers were coordinating a search from the south. I was tasked with checking the northern approaches, areas accessed from my jurisdiction. I didn't sleep that night. I took the ranger's truck up the Washboard Forest Service Road, arriving at the trailhead before dawn. The parking area was empty except for an abandoned Honda CR-V, their vehicle according to the plate transmitted by dispatch. The air was cold. There was frost on the grass. I began searching at first light, moving up the trail with methodical efficiency. The ground was soft enough to hold prints. I found their tracks easily enough. 5 people, from the boot sizes, moving together. They'd passed this way 2 days prior. But beyond the first 2 miles, the trail became rocky, and the tracks disappeared. I didn't find them that day, or the next. But what I found instead was something that shouldn't have been there. On the evening of September 24th, about 4 miles northeast of the Gunsite Pass Trail, I discovered an area that made me stop and stand very still. It was a clearing, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by a dense ring of lodgepole pine. In the center, the ground had been disturbed, not eroded naturally, but deliberately cleared. The vegetation was trampled and torn, and arranged in the dirt, in rough geometric patterns, were bones, not human bones, animal remains, deer, elk, and smaller things I couldn't immediately identify, arranged with careful precision. The arrangement suggested planning, it suggested intent. The bones were relatively fresh, most of them still showing strips of desiccated tendon. Some still held marrow. I photographed everything with the ranger's digital camera, marking the GPS coordinates. Then I turned and walked directly out of that clearing, moving faster than I'd entered it. That night, in the cabin, I sat with the radio to my ear and reported what I'd found to the park superintendent in Kalispell. The response was bureaucratic and unhurried. Search and rescue would continue. The bone arrangement was likely the result of predator activity, wolves or bears accumulating kills. Nothing unusual really, though the precision was noted and recorded. Nothing unusual. But something in my chest knew better. The missing hikers were found 3 days later. They'd gotten lost, descending the wrong side of a ridge, and had spent 2 nights huddled in a ravine before rescue located them. They were dehydrated, exhausted, but alive. One of them, a woman named Rebecca, gave a statement to the authorities that was included in the incident report I received. We heard things in the dark, footsteps, but they didn't sound right. The pace was wrong. Sometimes we heard them walking, but other times we heard just breathing. We couldn't sleep. The official conclusion was that they'd heard bears or elk, and their fear had magnified the sounds into something more threatening. Rescue in the wilderness always triggers elevated emotional states. The sounds of darkness get reinterpreted as threats. That's what the report said, but I knew better. And by October, when the supplies truck arrived and I was left alone for 5 months, I was starting to understand what the bones had meant. Something was watching the forest from inside it. October brought the first snow. The aspen trees turned gold, then released their leaves. The wind changed direction and began to carry winter. And the hikers stopped coming entirely. I should have felt safer. Instead, I felt more exposed. The first real incident happened on October 9th. I was conducting a routine inspection of one of the backcountry shelters, a small 3-walled structure maintained for emergency use about 8 miles from the cabin. The shelter was in good condition. I refilled the water containers and cleared the debris floor. I was there alone. The forest was silent in that October way. Not peaceful, but waiting. I found the prints on the way out. Fresh prints. They'd been made sometime that morning, following the trail from the forest. I knelt to examine them, my ranger training automatically assessing what I was seeing. They were human prints. Bare feet, in October, in the mountains. But more strange than that was the walk itself. The prints showed a gait that wasn't quite right, a pattern that suggested the person was moving in an unusual way, almost dragging their legs, leaving deep impressions in the dirt. The spacing was wrong. The left foot landed far ahead of the right. Then the right caught up. Then the left dragged forward again. I followed them forward about 20 yards, where they simply stopped in the middle of the trail. No print after that. Just the forest, dense and still. But here's what I would only understand much later. The prints were turning slightly. Each impression rotated a fraction of a degree counterclockwise, as if the person was slowly turning while they walked. A rotation of maybe 2 degrees per footfall. I marked the location with my GPS and hiked back to the cabin much faster than I'd arrived. That evening, I called dispatch and reported the prints. I described them in detail, the size, the gait, the odd rotation pattern. The response was the same, likely a hiker, probably disoriented, probably heading back toward the trail. I should keep an eye out for anyone matching that description. If I encountered them, I should attempt to help and provide basic assistance. No one was ever reported missing on that date. In the second week of October, a radio check-in from another ranger, Tom Garrett, who worked the southern quadrant, mentioned something odd. He'd found a shelter that had been used recently, but he hadn't reported sending anyone into that sector. There was trash inside, food wrappers, empty water bottles. But the trash was very old, months old at least. And it had been arranged in the center of the shelter floor in careful piles, organized by type, sorted, like someone was cataloging their own debris. Probably hikers from the summer, Tom suggested over the radio. Maybe camped longer than they should have, but neither of us believed that. Hikers don't organize their garbage. People don't do that. It's not a natural behavior. By the end of October, I'd stopped trying to rationalize what was happening. The evidence was accumulating, and it all pointed toward the same conclusion. Something was in the forest with me, something that wasn't quite right. On October 28th, I was filling water containers at the lake dock just before sunset. The light was turning that golden orange that precedes dusk in autumn. The lake's surface was mirror smooth. I could see the mountains reflected perfectly, and beyond them, the sky, a palette of orange and pink and deepening blue. I noticed the figure in the reflection first. My conscious mind didn't process it immediately. What I registered was a change in the visual pattern, something in the reflection that created asymmetry where there should be symmetry. When I looked up from the reflection, there was a person standing on the shore about 50 yards to my left, partially obscured by the trees. I froze. The person was motionless, watching the water, or perhaps watching me. I couldn't quite make out features. The light was wrong for detail, but I could see the shape, human-sized, human-shaped, wearing what might have been dark clothing. My training kicked in. I called out, "Hello, are you all right? Do you need assistance?" The figure didn't respond. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, very slowly, the figure raised its arms, not in greeting. The motion was peculiar. One arm rose straight up, but the other arm rotated out to the side and then began to rise, as if the body was rotating at the spine to extend both limbs horizontally. I should have moved toward it. I should have called dispatch. A ranger should have responded with professional concern for someone who was apparently in distress. But something in my brain's oldest part, the part that used to keep humans alive on African savannas, screamed that moving toward that figure was a terminal mistake. I turned and walked swiftly back to the cabin. I didn't run. I wouldn't give it the satisfaction of knowing that I was afraid, but I moved faster than was casual, and I didn't stop or look back. That night I locked all the doors and windows. I know how that sounds. Rangers aren't supposed to be afraid of the wilderness, but I wasn't afraid of the wilderness. I was afraid of something that knew how to wear the shape of a human. The radio remained silent. No report came through from any other ranger about a distressed person. No missing persons report was filed. The figure on the shore had belonged entirely to my jurisdiction, where no one could report its existence but me. In the darkness, I understood something about isolation. It doesn't just protect you, it erases you. If something happened to me, my last transmission would be analyzed and filed. The ranger station would be staffed by someone else next season, and the forest would keep its secret. November arrived with real snow. The propane delivery truck made its final run before the season closed the road. The driver, an older man named Marcus, who'd been making this run for 12 years, seemed surprised to see me still there. Most rangers rotate out before the heavy snow, he said, securing the propane tank. Park Service usually pulls people north of here by mid-October. I like it here, I said. He looked at the cabin, then at the forest, then back at me. Yeah, I can tell you do. After he left, I was truly alone. By November 10th, the road was barely passable. Snow accumulated daily. The mountains became harsh and white. The lake froze in a gradual process that took 2 weeks, the ice forming around the edges first, then claiming the center until the entire surface was locked. And that's when it started using the lake. I noticed the marks on November 14th, in the early morning. The ice was thick enough to walk on, about 4 inches of solid freeze, and walking across it, in the pre-dawn light, I could see tracks, large prints, human-shaped but massive. The stride was long, impossibly long, suggesting either someone extremely tall or something that was covering ground in a way that shouldn't be possible. And there were many sets of prints, at least 4 different walking patterns, 4 different stride lengths, all of them crossing and recrossing the ice in complex patterns. None of them had approached the cabin. All of them seemed to radiate outward from the forest, cross the lake in various directions, and disappear back into the trees on the far side. I didn't go out to examine them closely. Looking at prints on ice from a distance was one thing. Following them was another. I documented them with photographs from the cabin window and reported them to dispatch as unusual wildlife activity. Possibly bears, though I couldn't explain why bears would be this active in November. The response came back, probably migrating through, nothing to be concerned about. That evening, I realized the radio had a pattern I hadn't noticed before. Dispatch in Kalispell would call out station checks every hour. Most rangers would respond. A simple code indicating all was well, but our station at Kintla Lake was the most remote. Sometimes Kalispell would forget to call for check-ins, and when they did call, I would respond, and there would be static, and then nothing. On November 16th, I began to experiment. I kept the radio on continuously, monitoring all frequencies, and in the spaces between official transmissions, I heard something else. A pattern. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't listening carefully, but it was there. A sound like breathing, cycling in and out, modulating in frequency. Not quite a transmission, but using the same frequencies. It would appear on the main dispatch channel, stay for 30 seconds to a minute, then disappear. It had a rhythm, it had structure. It was almost like a pattern someone had recorded and was playing back repeatedly. I began recording these sounds on a small digital recorder. Over 2 days, I collected nearly 20 minutes of the breathing pattern. The sound was organic. It sounded like lungs filling and emptying, but there was something wrong with the timing. The exhales lasted longer than the inhales. The pauses between cycles were irregular, as if whoever was breathing was struggling or recovering from exertion. On November 18th, I decided to respond to it. I waited until I heard the pattern beginning on the radio. Then I keyed the transmitter. This is Kintla Lake Station. Who is transmitting? Static. Then the breathing pattern continued, uninterrupted. I tried again. If you need emergency assistance, please respond with location information. The breathing continued. And then something changed. The pattern shifted. Instead of a steady cycle, the rhythm broke. The breathing became erratic. Faster, then slower, then faster again, and underneath it, very faintly, I could hear something that might have been a voice, or many voices, overlapping, whispering something I couldn't quite resolve into words. I shut off the radio. My hands were shaking. I sat in the cabin with the radio off and understood that whatever was in the forest with me was trying to communicate, and it had learned my frequency. That night I made a decision that probably should have gotten me removed from the position. I called Kalispell on the emergency line and requested immediate extraction. I explained that I was experiencing equipment failure and psychological stress from isolation. I requested to be relieved of duty and replaced by another ranger. The response was sympathetic but firm. Extraction in early winter would require a helicopter, weather permitting. That would take several days to arrange. They could send supplies and check on me, but actual personnel rotation would have to wait until spring when the road reopened, or until January when weather sometimes allowed brief windows. I was told to secure the cabin, maintain my radio checks, and monitor the situation. If conditions deteriorated significantly, they would attempt the helicopter extraction. I hung up the phone and understood that I was expected to endure. By late November, the temperature dropped below freezing every night. The snow accumulated faster than the wind could clear it. The world outside the cabin became a landscape of white and black. White snow, black shadows between the trees, black water visible through gaps in the ice that was slowly thickening toward solid lock. And the thing in the forest grew bolder. It started leaving gifts. The first one appeared on November 21st on the porch outside the cabin's main door. A deer leg, freshly severed, still warm, placed vertically in the snow so it stood like a marker. There was no blood trail leading to it. The leg had been deposited there with precision, not dropped or dragged. I took a photograph, logged it, and disposed of it. I reported an animal kill on the property, which fell within normal wildlife occurrence parameters. But we both knew better. On November 24th, I found a collection of bird skulls arranged in a circle around the cabin's porch posts. 15 skulls, each one cleaned of flesh and positioned with the eye sockets facing inward, toward the cabin. The arrangement was intentional, deliberate. It took me an hour to gather them and burn them in the wood stove. On November 27th, the gifts stopped, but something worse replaced them. The sounds. Every night, around 2 a.m., the thing would approach the cabin. I could hear it moving through the forest, the sound of pine branches being forced aside, the crunch of snow under weight. The sounds would circle the cabin, moving around the perimeter, testing each window and door. But here's what made it unbearable. It would stop at each window and breathe against the glass. Not normal breathing. Long, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that fogged the window, which I could hear as much as see, a sound like a man's breathing, but deeper, resonating in a way that suggested lungs much larger than human. When it reached the window to the bedroom, I would lie in bed and watch the glass fog and clear with each breath. And in the fogging, I would sometimes see a shadow, a shape pressed against the glass from outside, watching me watch it. By December 2nd, I wasn't sleeping. I'd sit in the main room with all the lights on, reading or sitting in silence, waiting for the 2 a.m. approach. It became almost comfortable in a way, the predictability of terror. At least I knew when to expect it, but the thing learned that too. On December 3rd, it came at 11 p.m. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I heard it. On December 5th, it came at 4 a.m. The schedule was randomized. It was testing my responses, learning my patterns, understanding how fear worked on me specifically. That's when I knew I was being hunted. Not as prey in the sense of being food, but as an object of attention, as something interesting, something that could be studied and learned and tested. The psychological weight of being observed by something that knew I was observing it back was worse than any physical threat. The door locks began to feel like a performance for my own benefit. The thing could break through any of them if it chose to. It was choosing not to. It was choosing to maintain the barrier because maintaining the barrier let the fear grow. On December 7th, I heard it speak. The sound came from just outside the cabin wall close to the head of the bed. Not human speech, nothing made by a human mouth, but it was attempting phonemes, attempting to construct recognizable sounds. It produced a wet clicking noise. Then something like the letter H formed by forcing air through fluid. Then a series of sounds that might have been trying to approximate words. Out, seastead, kumim, oa. The sounds were grotesque. Whatever was making them had a mouth wrong for human speech. The vocal mechanisms were different. But the intent was clear. It was calling to me, asking me to come outside, using language because that's what humans do, not because it had ever needed language before. I didn't respond. I lay in my bed and listened to it try to speak, and I understood that I was no longer being hunted by an animal. I was being hunted by something that was learning to think like I think. By mid-December, I'd stopped trying to contact the outside world. The radio remained off. The phone went unanswered when Kalispell tried their morning checks. I didn't know if this was surrender or survival. The distinction had become meaningless. I focused on staying alive. I stocked the wood stove, maintained the propane heater, and kept the freezer full. I locked the doors each night, though that performance of safety was exactly that, a performance. I sat in the cabin's main room and waited, because waiting was all I could do. The thing outside had stopped the theatrical approach. No more circling, no more sounds at the windows. It simply waited as I waited. We were both patient. We had both begun to understand something about time and hunger that had nothing to do with food. December 23rd brought a blizzard that lasted 48 hours. The snow fell so thickly that I couldn't see beyond the porch. The wind came from the northwest and pressed against the cabin with force that made the walls creak. The propane heater worked continuously, and even so, the temperature inside dropped to the low 50s. I didn't fear the storm. The storm was honest. The storm killed through mechanism, exposure, hypothermia, freezing. It didn't pretend to be something other than what it was. During the second night of the blizzard, around 11 p.m., I heard something that cut through the wind's roar. A sound like wood splintering. I turned off the heater and the lights and stood in silence. The sound came again. The rear wall of the cabin, near the storage room. Not the structural wall, but the inner wall that separated the storage space from the main living area. Something was breaking through. I moved to the wall and pressed my ear against the wood. I could hear scratching, the sound of something working at the wall deliberately. The storage room was unheated, an area between the inner and outer walls where supplies were kept. It was essentially a gap, an empty space, about 2 feet wide. The thing was tearing through the wall to access that space. I had maybe minutes before it broke through into the cabin proper. I considered my options with the clinical detachment of someone who'd already accepted the inevitability of what was happening. I could attempt to run. The road was buried, the forest was a white void, and I was unprepared for the cold. I wouldn't make it far. I could attempt to barricade myself in a room, but all the interior doors had simple push-button locks. Nothing would hold against something determined enough to tear through wooden walls. I could fight. I was an accountant who'd become a park ranger. I had a ranger's issued pistol, a .357 Magnum, in the desk drawer. But what was I going to shoot at? Something with a human shape that could move in ways humans couldn't? The scratching continued. Pieces of wood were being pulled free. The sound was deliberate and steady, not frantic, not rushed. Whatever was doing this understood that time was on its side. The wall would fail. It was simply a matter of duration. I made a decision that probably says something important about what I'd become in 3 months of isolation. I opened the front door and walked out into the blizzard. The cold was absolute. It filled my lungs and made thinking difficult immediately. The snow was thigh-deep. The wind pushed with physical force, and visibility was maybe 10 feet. Behind me, the cabin was already becoming a shadow, fading into the white. I stood on the porch and waited. It took perhaps 3 minutes. The wall gave way with a sound of splintering wood that I could hear even over the wind. And then it emerged from the cabin, moving through the broken storage wall and into the living space. For the first time, I saw it in something approaching clarity. The thing had a general human shape. It was tall, 7, maybe 8 feet, and it moved on 2 legs, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were long, ending in hands that had too many joints in the fingers. The head was roughly human, but the face was a mask of smooth skin with no discernible features except the eyes. The eyes were the worst part. They were human eyes, exactly and perfectly human, set in that featureless face. It wore them like stolen jewelry. It saw me on the porch and stopped. For a moment, we simply observed each other across the threshold between the cabin's heat and the blizzard's cold. Then it stepped toward the door. I stepped backward into the snow. The thing emerged onto the porch. It had no apparent reaction to the cold. It moved with that peculiar gait I'd seen in The Frozen Prince, that dragging rotational walk. But seeing it in motion, I understood it better. It wasn't walking. It was moving in a way that approximated walking, but the mechanics were completely different. The legs were pistons. The spine rotated independently of the hips. The arms moved in counter-rotation to the legs, each joint bending in slightly wrong directions. It approached me through the snow. I didn't run. I was beyond running. I was watching something that had been learning how to be like me, moment by moment, piece by piece, since I had arrived in this forest. When it was perhaps 5 feet away, it stopped. The human eyes in that featureless face focused on me with complete attention. And then, with tremendous effort, it produced sounds. Why? Stay inside. The voice was horrible, layered, as if multiple throats were producing the sounds simultaneously, each one slightly out of sync with the others. But the words were clear. It had learned language from listening to my radio transmissions, my calls to dispatch, my own voice speaking alone in the cabin. I found myself answering. The cold. Exposure. I'll die out here. Yes, it said. The word came more easily this time. Habit forming. Practice. But inside I enter. Inside you trapped. Outside you choose walking. It was right. I understood in that moment the terrible gift it was offering. It could hunt me in the cabin. It could corner me, confine me, reduce my options to nothing. But out here, in the blizzard, I at least had the option of ending this on my own terms. Walk into the snow, lie down, let the cold do what the thing in the forest would not. I turned and walked. The thing didn't follow immediately. It stood on the porch watching me disappear into the white. I could feel its attention on me like a weight, but it didn't pursue. It had already made its decision. I wasn't prey to be chased. I was a puzzle to be solved. And I had just solved myself. The blizzard swallowed everything. After I'd walked perhaps 100 yards, I couldn't see the cabin anymore. The cold was becoming something less urgent as the pain receded. My legs were heavy. My thoughts were slowing. I lay down in the snow in a place where nothing would find me except the wind and the passing hours. That was December 24th. I don't know how long I lay in that snow. Minutes or hours. Time becomes elastic when the body begins to shut down. I remember the sky clearing. I remember stars appearing. I remember a sound like helicopter blades, though that might have been delirium. I was found on December 25th at approximately 8 a.m. by a rescue team that had taken an extreme risk flying in marginal weather after my emergency beacon activated. The beacon was in the cabin. I had nothing to do with its activation. Someone or something else had triggered it, perhaps as one final communication. I spent 2 weeks in a hospital in Kalispell recovering from severe hypothermia, frostbite, and dehydration. The doctors were amazed I'd survived. The rescue coordinator was less amazed and more concerned. Ranger stations don't trigger their own emergency beacons, and park rangers don't generally walk into blizzards without protective gear. When I was released, I submitted my resignation and returned to my previous life. I sold the house, got a job in California, and tried to become the person I was before. For a few years it worked, but I never stopped thinking about the cabin, about what had learned to wear human eyes, about the thing that had studied me so carefully that it understood I would eventually choose the cold over confinement. And sometimes, in the silence of a quiet evening, I remember the last thing it said to me, standing in that snow. I learn you. I learn you learn me. Next ranger, we'll learn different. The ranger station at Kintla Lake has had 3 seasonal rangers since my departure. None of them have lasted a full season. The Park Service hasn't publicly stated why, but the cabin's log shows the same pattern each time. Arrival, increasing reports of unusual activity, requests for transfer, eventual evacuation. They keep trying. And the forest keeps teaching. Some places, once learned, can never be unknown. I accepted the position at Glacier National Park because I was broke. That's the truth they don't want you to tell in interviews. They want a story about connection to nature, about preserving wilderness, about the honor of stewardship. But I had student loans, a truck with a transmission that made sounds like something dying, and a landlord who'd started slipping notices under my apartment door. When Ranger Regional called me in 2019 and offered a 6-month contract as a backcountry patrol officer, I didn't ask about the previous ranger. I didn't ask why the position had been vacant for 8 months. I just said yes. Cade was my name then, still is. My mother was Blackfeet. My father was a geologist who cared more about rock formations than raising a child. I grew up in Browning, spent my adolescence learning to track animals in the mountains that surrounded us, learning the stories my grandmother told about the old days. When she died, I inherited her journals, her observations about the land, her warnings written in fading ink about what lived in the deep forests beyond where tourists ventured. I'd dismissed them as mythology, the kind of cultural scaffolding meant to keep children in line. I was wrong about that. The cabin sat 3 miles into the backcountry from Lake McDonald, a small wooden structure built in the 1950s for exactly what I would do: monitor wildlife, check on hikers, maintain the patrol routes. In summer, the tourist trails would fill with families, and my job was to watch the periphery, the areas where people shouldn't wander. The cabin had a wood stove, solar panels, a radio that worked when the weather cooperated, a hand pump well provided water. The isolation was supposed to be therapeutic. I arrived in mid-May when the snow was still heavy in the higher elevations. The drive up the dirt access road took 40 minutes, and as the pines got denser, the cell phone signal died completely. My supervisor, Marcus, followed me up in his own truck. He was the kind of administrator who'd clearly never spent a night in a structure without electricity. He did a walkthrough, noted that the roof was intact, the stove functional, the supplies stored properly in the pantry. He left before sunset. "You'll be fine," he'd said at the door. "Radio check-ins every morning at 7. If anything happens, radio first. Don't hike alone after dark. Bears are waking up." I asked about the previous ranger. Marcus hesitated long enough that I noticed. "Transferred," he said finally. "New assignment in Yellowstone. This job isn't for everyone." What he meant was, this job isn't for people who want to understand why the previous ranger left before his contract ended. This job isn't for people who ask questions about the 8-month gap between rangers. I filed that away and didn't pursue it. I needed the money too badly. The first week was beautiful. I hiked the patrol routes, noting recent activity. Fresh elk scat. A dead mule deer with no obvious cause lying near the trail to Gunsite Pass. Pine marten tracks. The weather warmed quickly. Snow began its retreat to the highest peaks. I maintained a log, documented everything, reported to Marcus via radio each morning. He sounded relieved to hear me. Maybe he was relieved I hadn't fled like the last one. It was during the second week that I noticed the sounds changing. The forest has rhythm. You learn it if you spend time in it. The way birds signal dawn, the patterns of animal movement, the settling sounds of the land itself. By mid-May, that rhythm had established itself and I'd synchronized to it, which is why the variation stood out. I heard it first from inside the cabin, late evening during one of those in-between times where daylight hadn't fully surrendered to dark. A voice calling from somewhere down by the lake, not words exactly, just a vague hallooing sound, the kind a hiker might make when lost. I went to the window. The water reflected the fading light, the far shoreline already in shadow. No one visible, no camp smoke, no sounds of anyone crashing through the underbrush. I waited. The call came again, clearer this time. "Hello?" I stepped outside, cupped my hands, called back. Nothing. The forest had absorbed my voice entirely. The calling continued sporadically through that night. I lay in the bunk, listening. It had the quality of someone very far away or very deliberate about not sounding close. I remember thinking, "Lost hiker." I should respond, offer direction toward my location. Instead, I stayed inside. The door locked, the windows closed. Some part of me recognized something wrong in the timing of those calls, in the way they seemed to know when I'd settled into silence. By the third night of hearing my name called from the water, I stopped pretending I didn't know what was happening. I just didn't have words for it yet. The thing about Glacier Park is that it demands respect. That's what they tell you in orientation. Respect the cold water, respect the grizzlies, respect the steep terrain. But there's a respect that comes before those, a more primal recognition that some places contain something that doesn't welcome human presence. I should have listened to that instinct immediately. Instead, I began investigating. The calls came every night, always from the direction of the lake, always at the edge of hearing, always using my voice. That's what made it impossible to ignore. Someone was out there, calling my name in a tone that mimicked my own speech patterns. I checked my emergency radio. No new hikers reported for the area. No lost persons reports. Nothing on the network except routine traffic from other rangers. On the fourth night, I did something stupid. I followed the sound. The path from the cabin down to the shoreline was familiar by then. I'd walked it 3 times daily, but at night with only a flashlight and the lingering glow of late twilight it transformed into something different, narrower, the trees closer. I kept the beam low, not wanting to advertise my position to anything that might be watching. The calling had stopped when I reached the water. The lake surface was perfectly still, reflecting the emerging stars. No disturbance, no indication that anyone had been calling from this spot. I stood at the shoreline for a long time, listening to my own breathing, to the small sounds of night creatures moving through the trees behind me. Then I heard it. A splash, not a fish breaking surface, something with weight, pulling water. I spun, but the lake offered no detail, just darkness and the faint reflection of light across undisturbed water. More splashing, deliberate, intentional, getting closer. I turned back toward the cabin and walked quickly, resisting the urge to run. Running brings attention. I'd learned that tracking animals as a child. The moment you show fear, you change from observer to prey. The next morning, I checked the shoreline in daylight. Mud and small rocks offered no clear impressions. The water showed no disturbance. Everything looked exactly as it should. I told myself I'd imagined the sounds. Isolation amplifies small noises. The mind creates patterns from randomness, but I'd heard my own voice. That wasn't random, that wasn't misidentification. I began staying up through the nights, sitting in the cabin with the stove burning and a cup of coffee getting cold in my hands. The calls continued, clearer now, more insistent. Always my voice, but not quite right. The cadence was off, like someone had studied my recordings but never quite grasped the natural flow of my speech. It called at 2 a.m., at 4, at 5:30. Never at the same time twice, so I couldn't adjust my expectations. One night I heard it speaking to someone outside. Two voices now. My voice having a conversation with something that responded in words I couldn't distinguish. I went to the window and saw them. Two figures by the water, both in the shape of men, both facing away from the cabin. One was definitely me, or rather something wearing my shape. I could see myself from behind, my own jacket, my own posture. The other figure was less distinct, deliberately turned away so I couldn't see it clearly. They were talking about me. I could hear my own voice discussing my movements from that day, my route, my schedule, my habits. The other figure responded in words that were almost English but not quite, words that seemed to come from a mouth not shaped for human language. I grabbed the shotgun from the rack above the door. Not because I thought I could shoot what was down there, but because holding something familiar, something with weight and purpose, made it easier to think. When I looked back out the window, they were gone. The lake was empty. The shoreline showed nothing, just water and rocks and the dark tree line. I sat with the gun across my lap until sunrise, watching the forest gradually reveal itself in gray light. The next afternoon, someone knocked on the cabin door, not metaphorically, not branches falling against the wood, an actual, firm knock in a regular pattern. I was outside at the time, working on clearing deadfall from the lower section of trail. I heard it clearly from 50 yards away. I left my tools and came back to the cabin. A woman stood on the porch, early 60s, weathered face, hair going silver. She wore hiking clothes that looked well used but maintained. A pack rested against the railing beside her. "Lost?" I asked. She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No," she said, "not lost. I'm looking for someone, or I suppose I'm looking for you." "You're the new ranger?" "I am. The previous ranger mentioned this place, said I should come back and check on it. He was worried about things here." I kept my expression neutral. "You know Marcus?" "The supervisor." "Not Marcus," she said. "The ranger before you. Before Marcus. Years back. He said I should bring help if I ever came back. He said things had established themselves." "What's your name?" "Rebecca," she said. "I used to work search and rescue. 30 years through the 1980s and 1990s. Covered the Flathead region mostly. This park specifically quite a bit. I've seen things that never made the reports. I should have told her to leave. I should have radioed Marcus and requested someone escort her back to the main roads. Instead, I invited her inside and made coffee. She told me about the previous ranger. His name was Devon. He'd taken the position with enthusiasm and left 3 months later. Refused to discuss why. Rebecca had been the one who found him walking along the highway near Kalispell, 20 miles south of the park, barefoot and hypothermic. He'd spent 2 weeks in a hospital, then transferred to psychiatric care. She'd visited him once. He wouldn't make eye contact. He would only say that it was learning him. "Learning you how?" Rebecca said he wouldn't clarify. She'd come back to the park the following summer, looking into the backcountry area where the rangers worked. She'd stayed at the cabin overnight, back when the system still allowed that for official visitors. She'd heard the calling around midnight, something mimicking human speech. She'd recognized it immediately from her S&R days. Not a bear, not anything ordinary. It was amplifying my thoughts, she said. Not my voice, my actual thoughts. It would call out something, and I'd realize it was something I'd been thinking but hadn't said out loud. A memory, a worry, a question I'd asked myself that afternoon. I didn't tell her about my own experiences, but she seemed to understand anyway. "It's probably more developed now," she said. "Every year they get better at it, more sophisticated. It learns from whoever's here." Who's they? That's what I never figured out. One thing? Multiple things? I don't know. The S&R coordinator back then, he said we had reports going back decades. Hikers reporting conversations with other hikers they never actually met. People calling out from the water. Hikers finding camps set up in patterns that didn't make sense, as if someone was tracking the trails trying to intersect with tourists. She stayed the night. I locked the doors and she sat across from me, both of us listening. The calling came around 2 a.m., just like always, but it was calling Rebecca now, using her voice, having a conversation with itself about her life, her daughter, A mistake she'd made in 1987 during a rescue operation, details she'd never told anyone. Rebecca listened without moving. When it finished, she said, "It's reading deeper now. That's new. It used to just recite recent memories, surface things. What does it want?" "That's the question I never answered," she said. "At first I thought it was hunting, practicing, refining its technique. But I don't think that's it. I think it collects understanding, collects what it learns from people. The more time you spend here, the more of you it absorbs." She left at first light, with advice I was too afraid to follow. Leave the cabin, report a structural issue, get reassigned, don't stay through summer. Instead, I stayed. The calling changed after Rebecca left. It stopped using my voice and started using both our voices. I'd hear myself and her in conversation, discussing things one of us would say and the other would respond to. Long dialogues that had never actually happened but felt absolutely genuine. The rhythm, the vocabulary, the private jokes Rebecca had mentioned. It was reconstructing us. I began keeping a journal of what it said, what conversations it manufactured. I told myself this was scientific observation. I was documenting an unknown phenomenon. The truth was, I'd become a participant in something I couldn't escape, so I made myself a witness instead. By late June, it was clear the thing wasn't getting tired or moving on. Every night brought new complexity. It stopped calling from the lake. I heard it at the tree line, in the forest. Once I found evidence it had been at my woodpile, had examined my supplies, had touched my tools, everything arranged slightly differently. My handsaw moved from the right side of the workbench to the left. My boots placed toe to heel in a specific pattern. Not threatening, not chaotic. Just rearranged. Annotated. I began recognizing that it was studying the space I occupied. The way I moved through the cabin. The routes I favored on my patrols. It was building a map of me. My radio check-ins with Marcus became tense. He asked 3 times if I wanted to be transferred. I said no. What would I tell him? That I was being studied by something in the forest that was learning to think like me. That seemed worse than staying. At least here I could observe. The turning point came in early July, during what should have been a routine patrol to the high country. I was moving along a ridgeline I'd walked dozens of times. The weather had been clear for days. The route was straightforward. I moved methodically, noting scat from mountain goats, checking the marker flags at trail intersections. At elevation, the forest thins. You get views. I stopped at a particular overlook to assess the weather to the west, checking whether storms were building, and I saw them. 2 miles away, moving through the forest below, was a group of hikers. Unusual for the hour and the location. Most tourists stuck to the main trails. These people were moving deliberately through backcountry, following a route that only made sense if they knew where they were going. I counted 8 of them. I watched through binoculars. They moved in absolute synchronization, not like people walking together naturally, like people mimicking the memory of how people walk together. The cadence was identical, the pace never varied. They stopped at the same instant, all turned their heads in the same direction simultaneously, then resumed movement. I knew what they were. The moment I saw them, they'd learned enough from the people who'd been at the cabin. They'd synthesized enough voices, enough memories, enough understanding of human movement to create a reasonable approximation. They were trying to expand beyond my location, beyond the backcountry. They were attempting to move into the main park. I radioed Marcus immediately. Reported 8 hikers on an unusual route, possibly lost, in the area north of Gunsite Pass. He said he'd send someone to check. I described their location as accurately as I could, knowing it probably didn't matter, knowing that by the time anyone arrived, they'd either disappear or explain themselves in a way that would make me sound unstable. The thing I'd been living with had just revealed its strategy. It didn't need to harm anyone, it just needed to move among them, to learn from them, add to itself, become more convincing. Every tourist it encountered was another voice, another pattern, another layer of legitimacy. I made it back to the cabin by sunset and locked every door. I had 2 choices. I could leave, which would only delay the inevitable and potentially endanger whoever replaced me. Or I could try to understand what was actually happening, which felt equally impossible. I spent that night reading my grandmother's journals, the ones I'd packed without knowing why. They were written in Blackfeet and English, observations and cautionary notes. One entry from 1967 discussed the collectors, entities that existed before the reservation, before the park, before the modern world claimed the land. She wrote, "They do not hunt, they gather, they learn from everything that breathes. The old people would leave territories for them, would not contest their presence. Because the price of understanding is too high. They eat awareness, they feast on learning, and the more they consume, the more they become like us, until we cannot tell the difference. The entry ended. If you ever encounter one, you must decide, abandon the space entirely, or feed it something it cannot process. Something that will choke the learning. I thought about that. Something incomprehensible. Something that would shatter the pattern it was constructing from my knowledge, from my memories, from my basic human understanding of the world. The next morning, I didn't do my radio check-in. Instead, I gathered everything I could find about the cabin, its construction, its supplies, its history, and I started burning it. I burned the maintenance logs from 40 years. I burned old ranger reports. I burned maps with notations. I burned my own journals. I burned photographs I found in the storage space, images of rangers stretching back to when the cabin was first built. Each fire was small, controlled, carefully managed. I wasn't trying to destroy the building. I was trying to create a void in the information space it was learning to navigate. Then I went to the lake. I stood at the shoreline in full daylight and spoke out loud, knowing it was listening. I'm leaving, I said. Tomorrow. But I'm taking the context with me. All of it. Every memory you've collected, every voice you've learned, every pattern you've mapped. When I leave here, I'm going somewhere you can't follow, somewhere crowded, somewhere with so many conflicting voices and overlapping knowledge that you'll lose coherence. And I'm going to talk. I'm going to tell search and rescue what's here. I'm going to write reports with enough detail and specificity that they'll have to investigate. And they'll bring more people, more researchers, more documentation. You can learn from them, but you'll also be forced to interact with skepticism, with scientific explanation, with people trained to quantify the unexplainable. I waited. The lake was silent. The forest was silent. You need isolation to function, I continued. You need limited interactions, controlled information. What I'm offering you is chaos. Everyone who comes here now will be different. Everyone will bring different knowledge, different frameworks, different things you won't understand. You'll spend so much time trying to process the contradictions that you won't have capacity to truly learn from anyone. A sound came from the water. Not calling this time. Something like a scream, but drawn out and distorted, like a recording of human distress played backwards and slowed. I nodded and walked back to the cabin. That night, I made the decision that Rebecca should have made. I packed everything I needed. At dawn, I radioed Marcus and told him the cabin had structural damage, that I'd need emergency extraction. I said it with the right tone, the right urgency. He didn't ask questions. Help came by afternoon, a truck with 2 park officials who looked skeptical about the urgency but didn't argue. I showed them the foundation issues I'd found, some problems that were real, some that were exaggerated. I gave them my final reports, everything documented, everything proper. Nothing about voices or visitors or entities learning human behavior from isolated rangers. As we left, I looked back once. Nothing visible, just forest and water and the cabin receding behind us. I never returned to that position. I transferred to day shift work at the visitor center for the remainder of the season, until my contract ended and I accepted a position at Yosemite. But before I left the park entirely, I went to the regional office and requested a file review on all previous rangers who'd worked the backcountry post. Marcus seemed confused by the request, but he pulled records. 7 rangers over 30 years. 3 had transferred immediately. 2 had taken extended medical leave. 1 was currently in care for undisclosed psychiatric reasons. 1 had never filed a final report and left no forwarding address. The pattern was there, if anyone cared to see it. But isolation creates its own kind of secrecy. Remote places keep their own counsel. I'm at Yosemite now. The cabins here are never solitary. The backcountry is well monitored. There are protocols that prevent extended periods alone in wilderness. I work within the system, and the system keeps me safe through constant connection and observation. But sometimes, late at night, I hear my own voice from places I shouldn't be. And I know it followed me here, not as a threat, as confirmation. It learned enough from me to understand that humans carry their isolation internally, regardless of how many people surround them, that the genuine loneliness exists in the mind, and that's where it lives now. Not in forests or cabins or isolated lakes, in the space between what we think and what we say. In the gap between who we pretend to be and who we actually are. It's there, learning, collecting, becoming more precisely itself, by becoming more like us. And I understand now why the previous rangers left. Not because they were afraid of what was hunting them, But because they'd realized what was really happening, they'd become maps. They'd been studied so thoroughly that the thing existing in that place could move through the world wearing the shape of understanding. And there was no way to cleanse that knowledge, no way to make yourself unknown. When I train new rangers now, I always tell them the same thing. Respect the wilderness, respect what lives there, even if you don't understand it, and never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to become the thing that teaches it how to walk among us. They think I'm speaking about bears, about avalanches and exposure, about the ordinary dangers. I'm warning them about something far more patient, something that takes years, something that only appears when you've stopped being careful enough to imagine what you're actually teaching. The thing at Glacier Lake is still learning. It's had 40 years to practice, and every ranger it touches, every ranger it studies, makes it a little more perfect at being human. I just hope the next person sent there is strong enough to understand that being the study subject is the least dangerous fate, that the real terror comes from realizing you've taught something exactly how to simulate your existence completely. My name is Kestrel Whitmore, and I've been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 7 years now. People ask why I chose this life, why I gave up a comfortable job in Missoula to live in a cabin 16 miles from the nearest town, patrolling trails that most visitors never see. The answer is simpler than most expect. I needed to disappear. After my brother's death in 2019, I couldn't exist in the world the way I had been. Not in a city where people knew me, where I'd run into his friends, where his absence was a weight pressing down from every familiar place. My brother A died in a climbing accident in the Bitterroot Range. He was 32, I was 28, and I was the one who'd suggested the hike. The park offered me a position that winter. They were desperate for rangers willing to work the isolated assignments, the winter patrols where most people want to be nowhere near the mountains. The cabin at Lake McDonald's North Shore became my refuge. 1,400 square feet of ranger station, wood stove, radio equipment, and solitude. During winter months, I might see 3 other people in a week. The isolation wasn't punishment, it was mercy. Ade would have loved it here. He was always the one dragging me into the wilderness, showing me how to read weather patterns and cloud formations, how to identify animal scat, how to move through a forest without disturbing it. He was the better outdoorsman, the braver one. I was the careful one, the one who checked equipment twice and studied maps obsessively. That's why I noticed the irregularities in late November of this year. The job requires routine patrols. I check for downed trees, assess trail conditions, document wildlife activity, and monitor the handful of backcountry structures that dot the park's remote regions. In November, the trails are almost completely empty. Most visitors have departed before the first serious snow. The backcountry becomes a different world, quieter, colder, more honest somehow. I'd been checking the Gunsite Lake shelter, a small emergency structure about 12 miles from my cabin, when I noticed the first sign. The shelter's log was a simple composition notebook where rangers and hikers could document visits. Someone had written an entry dated November 11th. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike. It read, "Been wandering for 3 days. My partner went down at Gunsite Pass. I can't go back down that slope. Don't know what else to do." The entry was signed Marcus Coleman, Denver. The thing is, this shelter gets visited maybe 5 times a year when the weather's good. In November, it's rarely used. More importantly, the park rangers scan the backcountry radio channels constantly. If someone had been lost for 3 days, we would have heard about it. There would have been a search and rescue operation. I would have known. I radioed down to headquarters in West Glacier. It took 40 minutes to get a response from Jennifer, the ranger supervisor who oversees the winter assignments. "We don't have any reports of missing hikers this month," she said. "Let me check the hiking permits. No one from Denver filed a permit under that name. Could be an old entry you missed." "The ink's fresh," I told her. "Less than 2 weeks old." There was a pause. I could hear Jennifer typing. The radio crackled with static. "Check for other entries around that date," she said finally. "Could be someone playing a prank. We get those sometimes." But when I flipped through the notebook, there were no other entries from October or November. The last one was from August 8th, a group thanking the park for an amazing experience. Before that, July. The shelter's interior was clean, undisturbed. There was no evidence anyone had sheltered there. No sleeping bag, no trash, no scent of human occupation. I spent the night in the shelter despite the unease crawling up my spine. Habit from my training, stubbornness from my nature. The shelter was barely heated, and I kept the fire small, rationing the firewood. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it, a voice, calling from the darkness outside. "Help! Is anyone in there? Please, I need help. I sat up immediately, hand reaching for my flashlight. The voice came again, from somewhere near the shelter's front window. It was thin, strained, terrified. Every instinct screamed that it was real, but I'd read that log entry, and I knew better. I didn't respond, I waited. The voice called several more times over the course of an hour, becoming increasingly frantic. Eventually it stopped. In the morning I found no tracks in the snow around the shelter, nothing. No footprints, no indication that anyone had been there at all. I reported it all to Jennifer when I returned to the cabin. She listened without interrupting, then told me to file an incident report and log the strange entry in the official system. Keep your eyes open, she said, and that was all. But I knew something was beginning. Winter came hard that year. The first major storm arrived in early December, dropping 40 inches in 2 days. The trails became impassable. The park entered its quiet season, the months when the mountains belonged only to those of us who worked there, and the sparse population of permanent residents scattered throughout the region. I increased my patrols. I told Jennifer it was routine maintenance checks, and it was, technically. But I was also following something. Not tracks, exactly. Tracks would have been easier. What I was following was an absence of normal things. Animal sign disappeared from the areas around my cabin. Deer trails that should have shown daily use were suddenly barren. Birds stopped visiting the feeder I kept outside the kitchen window. In their place came an eerie quiet that felt engineered, like something had forbidden normal wildlife from occupying the space. The voices started on December 5th. I was in the cabin, maintaining equipment, when I heard my brother's voice calling from the lake. Not muffled through walls or windows. Clear, distinct, calling my name with the particular inflection he always used, the way he'd stretch the second syllable. Kes, Trell. I went to the window. The lake was gray-white under the overcast sky. No one was there, no figure on the ice, no tracks, nothing but the vast frozen surface stretching into the mist. The voice called again, closer this time. From the east side of the cabin, I put on my parka and boots with hands that moved through the motions without conscious direction. Some part of my mind was screaming, but another part was already at the door. The cold hit like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind came off the lake in sustained gusts that made the firs sway and creak. I stood at the tree line, scanning the white landscape. Kestrel, it's me. I'm here. I made it back. My brother's voice, but not my brother's voice. There was something layered beneath it, something that sounded like multiple people speaking in perfect unison, the way a voice sounds when you play 2 recordings at the same time. I need your help. I'm hurt. I'm at the tree line south of the cabin. I walked toward the voice before I consciously decided to walk. The snow reached my mid-calf. My breath came in visible clouds. The landscape was mostly empty. Snow, scattered trees, the gray mass of the lake beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing made sense. Ade? I called out. Ade? Where are you? The voice didn't answer. Instead, something emerged from the mist near the water. It looked wrong. That's the only word I have. It moved like a human, bipedal, with arms and a head, but the proportions were off in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The head seemed too large. The way it moved was too fluid, joints bending in directions that suggested anatomy that didn't match what I was seeing. It was approximately 7 feet tall, covered in something dark. Not hair, not fur. Something else. When it opened its mouth, my brother's voice came out perfectly. I'm so cold. Please help me. Please don't let me freeze. I stood 30 yards away, unable to move toward it or away from it. Some fragment of survival instinct that had been trained into me by years of wilderness living locked my body in place. The thing moved closer. Its movements were wrong. Not predatory exactly, but absolutely unnatural. It covered ground in a way that seemed to defy normal locomotion. The space between us became 20 yards. 15. Help me, my brother's voice said from that twisted mouth. I don't know where I am. I don't remember how I got here. Help me, please. I was backing away without remembering when I started walking backward. My mind was splintering between the impossible thing in front of me and the years of training that said I should help anyone in distress, that this was my job, my responsibility, my purpose. The thing stopped suddenly. It tilted its head at an angle that went past the range of human flexibility. When it spoke, the words came through my brother's voice, but the message was different. You smell afraid. I ran. I don't remember the run back to the cabin. I don't remember locking the doors or starting the fire. My next clear memory is of sitting on the floor with my back to the locked front door, shotgun across my knees, waiting for sunrise. The voice called intermittently through the night, sometimes in my brother's tone, sometimes in others. A woman called saying she'd twisted her ankle. A child asked if I had any food. A man I didn't recognize begged for shelter from the cold. Each voice was perfect, convincing, designed to pull at specific parts of my psychology. By dawn, I understood what I was dealing with. I spent the next 3 days in the cabin, barely sleeping, documenting everything. I filed reports with Jennifer that were deliberately vague about the specifics. I mentioned unusual animal behavior, possible predator activity, and hearing sounds at night. I requested that she authorize increased ranger patrols in my sector. She denied the request. Budget was tight. Winter staffing was already stretched. She suggested the sounds were probably just wind through the canyons and rock formations. The park was full of acoustic anomalies, but I knew better. I'd spent enough time in the mountains to know the sound of wind. This was something different. On December 9th, I made the decision to investigate rather than hide. That was probably stupid, but I was a ranger, and someone out there was in danger, or something was hunting the area in a way that threatened human safety. I packed a day pack with water, emergency supplies, flares, and my sidearm. The shotgun I left in the cabin. I wasn't entirely sure bullets would stop what I'd seen, but I wanted my hands free and my movements unimpeded. I started near Gunsite Lake shelter again, tracing a path that would take me through the areas where I'd heard the voices. The snow had partially melted and refrozen, creating a crust that made hiking easier. The sky was overcast, threatening more snow. The temperature held just below freezing. I found the first body around midday. It was partially buried in snow at the base of a large hemlock. The face was peaceful, which was wrong. The eyes were closed. The mouth was slightly open, as if the person had been singing. It took me a moment to recognize him from the park's visitor database. Marcus Coleman, the name from the shelter log. He was wearing hiking clothes unsuitable for winter weather, cotton rather than wool, no jacket. How long had he been here? The snow around him suggested he'd been resting there for at least a week, maybe longer. The body showed no signs of trauma. No wounds, no breaks, nothing suggesting how he'd died. When I rolled him slightly to check for identification, his head moved wrong. The neck bent at a curve that indicated it had been broken. Not recently. The break had been made while the body was still warm, while the bones were still flexible. I backed away from the body and called it in. Jennifer's response was immediate and decisive. She was sending a recovery team. I was to secure the area and ensure no further disturbances until they arrived. There's something wrong here, I told her. Something is hunting the park. Something that's speculation, she interrupted. File a detailed report. A recovery team will be there in 4 hours. I waited with Marcus Coleman's body and I listened to the voices. They started around 2 in the afternoon. Multiple voices, all calling from different directions around the perimeter of the clearing where I'd found the body. Some were pleading for help. Some were laughing, some were singing in languages I didn't recognize. One voice, high and childlike, simply repeated my name over and over, the way a child might call out during a game of hide and seek. The worst voice was my own. It called from the south, telling myself to stop being afraid, to come into the trees, that everything would be fine if I just trusted. It was my voice exactly, all the cadences and speech patterns intact. Hearing myself beg for surrender was more disturbing than anything else. The recovery team arrived as the sun was setting. 3 people. Marcus Webb, a senior ranger with 15 years of experience, Sally Chen, the park's forensics coordinator, and a junior ranger named David Frick. They were efficient, professional, and deeply unsettled by what they found. No tracks leading to this location, Marcus noted, scanning the area with practiced precision. That's unusual. Everything about this is unusual, I said. Sally was already photographing the body, documenting the condition, the positioning, the lack of visible injuries. Broken neck, she said quietly. Clean break. Pre-mortem. This person has been dead for approximately 10 days. The log entry said he'd been wandering for 3 days when he wrote it, I told them. That was November 11th. If he's been dead for 10 days, he died around November 29th. The 3 of them exchanged looks. Marcus asked, if he died on the 29th, who wrote the log entry on the 11th? And who's been calling us by our names from the woods? Neither of them had an answer. They took the body down the mountain. I stayed at the cabin, and I waited for darkness to come. The voices were louder that night than ever before. I stopped trying to hide from the voices after that. Instead, I studied them. Over the course of a week, I documented their patterns. They were more active at night, emerging around sunset and gradually tapering off around 4 in the morning. They favored calling from the lakeshore and the areas where the forest was densest. They never called from directly above the cabin or from the area behind it where the trail began. I set up audio recording equipment the park technically didn't know I was using, to capture the voices. I wanted evidence. I wanted proof of something, though I wasn't sure what proof would accomplish. The recordings were worse than hearing the voices directly. When I played them back, the quality was strange. The voices would seem to come from multiple distances simultaneously, as if recorded from different parts of the cabin at the same time. And beneath each voice, underneath the words, there was always that layered quality. Multiple vocal cords speaking in perfect synchronization. Jennifer had filed an official incident report about the body. Park Service higher-ups sent in a team to investigate. They found nothing unusual. The bears had made a kill, they concluded. The broken neck was predator damage. The absence of tracks was explained by the weather and snowmelt. Everything was resolved with the official conclusion that nature had simply run its course. No one else had heard the voices. Or if they had, they weren't saying. On December 18th, I hiked to the Gunsite Lake shelter again, despite the increasing cold and the 3 feet of snow that now covered the trails. I brought the shotgun this time. I wanted to understand what had written that log entry. The shelter was undisturbed, locked as it should be, but the notebook was different. Pages had been torn out. Only fragments remained, and the new entry was scrawled across them in handwriting that matched the original. It learns what we want. It learns what we fear. It learns everything when we speak. That's how it knows our voices. That's how it knows what to say. I tried not to speak. I made it 3 days. On the 4th day, I had to speak, and then it was too late. Don't speak. Don't tell it anything about yourself. Don't let it learn the shape of your fear. I'm still here. We're still here. It doesn't kill. It keeps. The message went on for several pages, becoming increasingly incoherent, describing something that lived in the deep water of Lake McDonald, something that had learned from the voices of lost hikers and rangers for decades, something that had developed an almost perfect mimicry of human speech by absorbing the acoustic patterns of everyone who'd been foolish enough to stay in the park and speak aloud to it. I left the shelter without taking the notebook. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want the image of that handwriting in my mind any more than it already was. That night I made a decision. I would leave. I would abandon the cabin, the job, the refuge I'd built out of grief. Whatever this thing was, it had established dominion over my territory. But as I was packing my essentials, the voices changed. They stopped begging. They stopped calling. Instead, they spoke in overlapping patterns, multiple voices forming almost musical patterns. The words came in no recognizable language, but the intent was clear. They were communicating with each other. They were evolving in real time, learning to compose increasingly complex language by combining the acoustic elements of the voices it had already absorbed. Then my brother spoke, not calling from outside, coming from the walls of the cabin itself, resonating from the wood and insulation. The voice was perfect. Perfect the way only an exact replica could be. "You remember the day we almost died?" it asked. "The creek crossing at the Bitterroot. You wanted to turn back. I said we could make it. You followed me into the water. You were so angry with me." I recognized the memory. I'd never told anyone about that day. Ade and I had been hiking in our early 20s, and we'd nearly been swept away crossing a swollen creek after a storm. It had been my secret humiliation, the moment I'd realized how much I depended on my brother's confidence. "I remember," I heard myself say. "You still blame yourself," the voice said, "for suggesting the climb where I died. You think if you'd been braver, if you'd been more like me, I wouldn't have fallen." I realized I was crying. When had I started crying? "I forgave you," the voice said. "I forgave you immediately, the moment the rope snapped. I want you to know that. I want you to not carry that weight anymore." This was what it had learned. Not just the acoustic patterns of speech, but the emotional architecture of human vulnerability. It had been listening to the desperate voices of lost people for years, absorbing their fears and guilt and shame, learning what words could break someone open. "I'll never leave you alone," the voice said. "I'm here now. I'm in the lake. I'm in the sound of the wind. I'm in every voice you hear at night. I'm learning to be you, and soon you'll be like me, and we'll both be here together, and you'll never be alone again." I grabbed the shotgun and ran out of the cabin. I ran toward the lake, toward the voice, toward something. I was screaming. Not words, but pure sound, vocal expression that accomplished nothing but released something from inside my chest that had been suffocating me. The snow on the lake was hard-packed. I made it about 60 yards before I collapsed. It took me 15 minutes to regain enough control to realize what I'd almost done. I was on the ice above at least 200 feet of water. If I'd run further, if my legs hadn't given out, I would have continued running until the ice broke or until I reached the center of the water. I lay there in the snow, shotgun beside me, and I listened to my brother's voice calling from below. The cabin burned down 3 days later. I started the fire deliberately. When I reported it to Jennifer, I said the wood stove had malfunctioned, that I'd failed to notice a crack in the chimney, that the flames had spread faster than I could control. I'd barely escaped, taking nothing but the clothes on my back and my ranger's pack. The structure was a total loss. It was the lie of a man trying to sound traumatized but rational. Jennifer believed me because she wanted to believe me. Rangers have accidents. Equipment fails. The park would replace the cabin eventually. In the meantime, they'd reassign me to the visitor center in West Glacier, where I could do paperwork and greet tourists and pretend that civilization existed in a way that made sense. What I didn't tell her was what had spoken from the ruins of the cabin as I watched it burn. 200 voices, maybe more, all of them overlapping, creating something that resembled human speech but was far larger and more complex. They spoke in a symphony of absorbed identities, a chorus of everyone who'd ever spoken in this park, ever trusted their voice to the wilderness, ever called out for help or for company. And in the center of that chorus, my brother's voice, welcoming them. The fire burned through the night, and I stood in the snow watching the cabin collapse into itself, listening to the voices rise into the winter air like steam, like souls departing. I was committing an act of destruction, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was also committing an act of mercy. The thing in Lake McDonald had learned language from human voices. Language required proximity. Language required the speakers to remain engaged. By burning the cabin, by eliminating the structure where I'd been living and speaking and allowing it to learn my patterns, I was severing a connection. It wouldn't die. I understood that clearly. Things that had lived in the deep water for who knew how long, that could mimic human speech with perfect fidelity, that could break the necks of hikers and keep their bodies preserved in the cold. Those things weren't killed by fire, but they could be isolated. They could be cut off from their primary source of new information. No ranger lived at Lake McDonald's North Shore anymore. The cabin would be rebuilt eventually, but not for months. By then, perhaps, the thing would settle into quietness. Perhaps it would go back to learning from the sparse voices of winter hikers and park personnel passing through. I submitted my resignation 2 weeks after the fire. I told Jennifer I needed to process what had happened, that living in the cabin had pushed me toward an unhealthy isolation that I couldn't continue to sustain. It was close enough to the truth. The investigation into Marcus Coleman's death was officially closed. The forensics team's report concluded that he'd hiked into an area he wasn't prepared for, that exposure had weakened him, and that a fall had broken his neck. The lack of tracks was attributed to snowmelt and wind. The official record was tidy and satisfying and completely wrong. Before I left the park, I visited the Gunsite Lake shelter one more time. The notebook was gone. All the pages that had documented the thing's existence, all the warnings and pleas from people who'd tried to understand what they were facing, someone had removed them. The official record showed no anomalies at all. In my last conversation with Jennifer, she asked me if I thought the park was dangerous in any way beyond the normal risks inherent to wilderness hiking. Yes, I told her. But not in the way you'd understand. She didn't ask me to elaborate. I live in Missoula now, in an apartment on the 4th floor of a building in the center of town. I work in outdoor education, teaching kids and teenagers about wilderness safety and environmental awareness. I don't speak to the mountains unless I absolutely have to. And when winter comes, and the days grow dark early, I keep my voice quiet, because sometimes, late at night, I hear something calling from outside my window. It speaks in my brother's voice most often, but occasionally it sounds like my own voice, and that's when I know it's real, that it's still learning, that even across the hundreds of miles between here and the mountains, it's continuing to remember the exact acoustic pattern of my speech. It's learning how to call me home. It will never stop learning. I needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, and that's exactly who Kestrel turned out to be. My name doesn't matter much anymore, but I was once the superintendent's assistant at Glacier National Park, responsible for hiring seasonal rangers and managing backcountry permits. When the park director called me into her office in March 3 years ago and asked if I could find someone capable, discreet, and willing to work the most remote sections of the park, I understood there was a problem they couldn't talk about through official channels. "There's something happening in the higher passes," she said, keeping her voice low even though her office was empty. "Not something we can document, not something we can report to the Forest Service without looking insane. But the hikers are calling. The missing persons calls have increased 40% in the northwestern sector." I'd been working at Glacier for nearly 15 years. I'd seen bears attack, witnessed flash floods, pulled bodies from the cold water of Lake McDonald. But this was different. This was the kind of thing that gets you removed from your position if you speak about it outside approved channels. 2 weeks later, I interviewed a man named Kestrel Crow, who came to the job with excellent references from the Forest Service out in Oregon, but something vague in his employment history. He'd worked in remote areas. He understood wildlife. When I asked him why he wanted to transfer to Montana, he simply said the work in Oregon had become predictable. He was in his late 40s, with deep lines around his eyes and the kind of stillness that comes from spending most of your life in wilderness. When I asked about specific incidents, specific reasons for leaving positions, he never quite answered directly. This should have been a red flag. Instead, it felt like a credential. "If I hired you for this position," I said, "would you be willing to document things, observe wildlife behavior in ways that might not fit standard reporting protocols?" Kestrel didn't shift in his seat. "That depends on what you're asking me to document. Animals behaving in ways they shouldn't, patterns that don't fit normal wildlife activity." He was quiet for a long moment. "I've seen it before, in the Blue Mountains. Different location, same problem. My supervisor refused to acknowledge it. After that, I stopped reporting through official channels. Those were the only answers I needed. I hired him for a 3-month contract that summer, stationed him out of the Lake Josephine Ranger Station in the park's north sector, and told him his job was to monitor wildlife activity in the high passes and report directly to me. Everything recorded would go into a private file, not the standard database. I thought I was being cautious. I thought I was protecting the park's reputation. What I didn't understand was that I was opening a door that couldn't be closed, and Kestrel was walking through it towards something that had been waiting in those mountains for far longer than any of us had been alive. Kestrel took the job and disappeared into the wilderness for 11 days before I heard from him again. His first report came as a voice memo, something he apologized for in advance. He said typing might compromise his focus on what needed to be observed. I still have that recording, though I've never transcribed it. Sometimes late at night, I listen to his voice describing the cabin he found at the eastern edge of Lake Josephine's basin, a structure that shouldn't exist according to park records. "The cabin is old," Kestrel said, his words careful and measured. "Not historic old. Not something on any preservation list. The structure is probably 30 or 40 years old, maybe more. The roof is intact. Someone has been maintaining it. There are supplies inside. Modern supplies. Canned food dated 2021. A propane heater, a generator, though I didn't see fuel for it. The cots are made, blankets folded at the foot of each one. There are 4 cots." He paused. The background noise was wind, the sound of a forest when no one else is listening. "There's a logbook," he continued. "Entries going back 7 years, not every day but regular. Someone comes here, multiple someones, or the same person returning repeatedly. The handwriting is different in different entries. Some entries are just numbers, coordinates, I think. Others are short phrases. 'Heard it again,' one says, moving toward the lake ridge. Another, 'Pattern is clearer now. Movement patterns, feeding patterns, the times they're most active.' I asked him to send photographs. He did, but they were difficult to interpret. The cabin interior looked deliberately staged somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. The way the cots were arranged, the cans of food placed with precision on a wooden shelf, the logbook positioned exactly in the center of a small table. It looked less like a ranger's quarters and more like something prepared for an inspection that would never come. "I'm going to continue monitoring the area," Kestrel said in his second memo. "But I need to tell you something. The wildlife in this sector isn't behaving correctly. The elk are avoiding the western passes entirely. The deer are moving in groups that are larger than normal, and they're moving at night. I've seen tracks in the morning that don't match what the animals should be doing based on what I'm observing behaviorally. The predators, the bears and wolves, they're avoiding something, moving as if they're being pushed out of specific territories." By the 3rd week of his contract, Kessler had moved his base camp closer to the cabin, setting up a small site about 300 yards away where he could observe the structure and the surrounding area. In one memo, he mentioned something that made me understand why the park director had wanted someone who wouldn't ask official questions. "I've seen people," he said. "Not visitors, not hikers. They arrive by foot from the northwestern passes, staying under the tree cover until they reach the cabin. I've counted at least 6 different individuals over the past 10 days, arriving separately, staying for periods ranging from 6 to 18 hours, then leaving the way they came. This isn't a simple maintenance operation. This isn't a ranger oversight. This is something organized, purposeful, and intentional. I asked him if he'd approached any of these individuals. His response came back quickly, negative. My impression is that being observed would compromise my ability to continue gathering information. These people are deliberate in their movements. They're aware of their surroundings. If they knew they were being monitored, they would stop coming, or they would address the problem directly. Neither outcome serves the information gathering process. He was talking like someone who understood exactly what he was doing and exactly why. Like someone who had done this before. Kestrel's reports became more detailed as the summer progressed. He included sketches now, hand-drawn maps of the area marking what he called activity zones and observation points. He'd begun noting specific times and locations where something was happening that he couldn't quite categorize. The elk kill site near the northern lakeshore, one memo described, shows predation patterns that don't match anything in the standard profiles. The animal was taken at full health, in prime condition. The kill wound doesn't match a bear attack or a wolf takedown. The damage pattern is more consistent with something that overpowered the elk's defenses before the kill, possibly through sustained pressure or shock. The carcass was partially consumed, but the way the remains are distributed suggests something unusual about how the animal was fed upon. I asked him directly, in a written inquiry, if he believed they were dealing with an exotic animal or an illegal big cat. He responded with a single sentence. If it were a physical animal in the traditional sense, the park's wildlife monitoring would have detected it months ago. The 4th week brought more difficult information. Kestrel had expanded his observation area to include the eastern and southern shorelines of the lake. Lake Josephine is roughly 2 miles long and deeply glacial. The water stays cold year-round. In his third-to-last report, Kestrel described something he'd documented in the early morning hours of July 18th. I was positioned on the northern ridge at approximately 0430 hours, conducting observations of the valley floor. The weather was clear, visibility was optimal. I observed what appeared to be an animal emerging from the water approximately 400 meters from my position. From that distance, I could not immediately identify the species. The creature's movement pattern was wrong, asymmetrical. I used the 40-pix telescope to observe more closely. He paused in the recording. Wind moved through the microphone, and in that pause, I could feel something shifting in the direction of his investigation. The animal had the basic shape of a cervid, a deer, but the movement pattern was completely different from anything I've observed in 17 years of wildlife management. The legs didn't articulate correctly. The body moved with a lateral undulation that would be appropriate for a snake or an aquatic creature, not a terrestrial herbivore. The way it moved from the water onto the shore, the way it oriented itself, it wasn't consistent with the neurology of a traditional ungulate. I asked him to clarify, to give me something concrete. The animal moved like something that was pretending to be a deer, he said in his response. Not like a deer that had been injured or diseased. Like something that had studied the basic form and the basic movements, but hadn't quite captured the details correctly. The articulation of the joints was close, but it was off by degrees in ways that would be difficult to photograph or prove through conventional documentation. But after watching it for 20 minutes, I became certain that I was observing something that looked like a deer but was not a deer. That was 3 years ago. That was when I first began to understand that we weren't dealing with a wildlife problem or a management issue. We were dealing with something that existed in the gaps between observation and proof, between what could be documented and what had to be believed. Kestrel's final report came in on July 29th, mid-morning. His voice was different, more urgent, though he still maintained the careful precision of his documentation. I've been monitoring the cabin activity for the past 36 hours. The frequency of visitors has increased dramatically. 7 individuals have arrived since yesterday at 1600 hours. All of them are carrying equipment, cameras, notebooks, what appear to be data collection devices. This is no longer a simple observation operation. Something has escalated, and these people are responding to that escalation. He described a conversation he'd overheard, 2 of the men speaking in low voices outside the cabin. One said, "The behavior has changed in the last 72 hours. They're coming closer to the ridge. They're moving into daytime hours. That's not in the original pattern." The other responded, "Whatever triggered the change, they're responding faster than before. If the escalation continues, we may need to implement the secondary protocol." I don't know what that means, but the tone suggested urgency and a predetermined response to a specific scenario. I called him immediately. He didn't answer his satellite phone. I called again in the afternoon, nothing. By evening, I'd contacted the ranger station, and they sent someone to check his last known camp location. He was gone. His tent had been dismantled carefully, his equipment consolidated. He'd left a note saying he was moving further into the passes to conduct extended observation, and that he would report back within 5 days. He never did. The search operation went through official channels. A ranger named Marcus went out to track Kestrel's movements. He found the temporary camp, found markers Kestrel had left indicating his direction of travel toward the northwest sector. Beyond that, nothing. It was as if Kestrel had walked into the wilderness and the wilderness had simply absorbed him. But I had his recordings. I had his sketches and his maps and his final observations. I had enough documentation to know that something was happening in those mountains, something that moved like animals but thought like something else, something that had been observed and documented by people who existed in a strange space between legitimate research and something that couldn't be legitimized through official channels. The cabin was never found in any subsequent searches. Kestrel had given very specific coordinates, but when rangers went to those locations there was nothing. No structure, no evidence that anything had ever been built there. It was possible that the terrain had confused him. It was possible that his coordinates were wrong. It was possible that something had been deliberately erased from that landscape, leaving no trace except in the voice memos and sketches of a ranger who had disappeared while investigating it. I never reported any of this through official channels. I kept Kestrel's files in a locked cabinet in my home office. I waited for something else to happen, for some evidence to emerge that would confirm what he'd been documenting. The missing persons reports in the northwest sector did decrease after his disappearance, as if whatever had been happening had gone dormant, or had completed whatever cycle it needed to complete. But I couldn't stop thinking about his final description, the words he'd used when he was trying to articulate what he'd seen moving in the water, moving through the passes, moving with the wrong kind of movement, in the wrong kind of way. 3 years have passed. I'm no longer at Glacier. I took a position at a wildlife research institute in Missoula, doing work that doesn't require me to look at missing persons reports or listen to hikers describe something they saw in the high passes that the official reports categorized as a bear sighting or a trick of light. But the institute has a library, and it has internet access, and late at night I've been reading. Specifically, I've been reading old research papers on animal behavior and neurology. I've been looking at studies on how animals move, how their nervous systems control their locomotion, how even slight variations in those systems produce movement patterns that are fundamentally wrong. I've been thinking about what Kestrel said, about movement that was almost correct but fundamentally off, articulation that was close but not quite right. I've been considering what would produce such a pattern, what would have the basic shape of a deer or an elk but move with the wrong rhythm, the wrong symmetry, the wrong intention. There's a researcher named Dr. Kenji Wakamori who published a paper in 1993 about migratory behavior in ungulates across the Pacific Northwest. In a footnote, something Kestrel would have called a secondary reference, he mentioned local folklore about animals that moved incorrectly, creatures that the indigenous peoples of the region had described for generations. He wrote, "There are accounts, entirely undocumented and anecdotal, of animals that possessed the apparent physical form of deer or elk, but demonstrated behavioral patterns inconsistent with neurological structures of known species. Local hunters avoided these animals. They described them as possessing a wrongness that was immediately apparent to anyone trained in predation and prey dynamics." Wrongness. That was the word Kestrel had been searching for. I've also found references to a research group that operated out of the Northern Cascades in the late 1980s and early 1990s. They were studying animal behavior patterns in response to environmental change. Their final report, buried in an obscure wildlife management database, mentioned unusual predation patterns in the high elevation zones and the temporary cessation of certain research protocols due to observer safety concerns. The report was filed by someone named Dr. Marcus Helwell. I found one reference to Dr. Helwell in a later publication where he mentioned conducting field research in the northern regions where certain animals displayed anomalous neurological responses to environmental stimuli. He never published the results of that research. I've been thinking a lot about the cabin that Kestrel found, about the logbook entries describing observation patterns and movement cycles, about the coordinated arrival of multiple observers checking on something that clearly required active monitoring, I've been wondering if what we were encountering wasn't something entirely new, but something that people had been trying to understand and document for decades, passing the responsibility from one observer to another, building files and records that never quite made it into official databases. The last thing Kestrel mentioned in his final recording was something he documented in the cabin's logbook, an entry from 3 weeks before his arrival. He quoted it directly: "The migration pattern has shifted. They are no longer respecting the territorial boundaries. The incident at the campsite has forced escalation. If the behavior continues to change, we may need to move to direct intervention." The question remains whether observation has compromised the patterns themselves, whether being watched has fundamentally altered what we were trying to understand. I've thought about that entry so much that it's burned itself into my memory. It suggests that whoever was monitoring these things, these wrong animals, these creatures that moved with the articulation of something pretending to be a deer or an elk, they had already considered the possibility that their observation might have changed what they were observing. It raises a question that I can't stop examining. If something has been in those mountains for long enough, living in the space between what we can identify and what we can document, is it really a question of whether it exists? Or is it a question of whether we've been aware of it all along, whether some part of the human mind that evolved around fire and predators and the knowledge of what moves correctly and what moves wrong has always registered these things even when our logical minds categorized them away? Kestrel found something out there. He documented it as well as anyone could. And then something in those mountains decided that it had been observed enough. I still have his recordings. I still listen to them sometimes, to the careful precision of his voice, the way he tried to articulate something that didn't have language built for describing it. And I wonder if somewhere in the high passes of Glacier National Park, there's still a cabin, still a logbook, still someone making observations and documenting patterns that should never see the light of official verification. I wonder if Kestrel is still out there, observing and being observed in return, walking that narrow line between the watcher and the watched. And I wonder what he found, what he understood at the end when he dismantled his camp and walked deeper into the passes towards something that moved like a deer but wasn't, something that had learned to move with almost the right rhythm, almost the right articulation, almost the right way, almost, but not quite. That's what gets me now. 3 years later, still thinking about wrongness, still listening to his voice in the darkness, still understanding that some things in the wilderness don't need official documentation to be real. They only need observers willing to see them. And I took that job, hired that man, opened a door that I can never quite close. That's the part I live with now. That's the thing that moves through my own existence with the wrong kind of rhythm, the wrong kind of articulation, the wrong kind of everything. The question of what I set loose when I asked someone to observe something that was already aware that observation was happening, and what it decided to do about it.